At Christmas dinner, my son toasted to finally owning something. I put down my glass and asked him one question that Christmas was supposed to be a quiet one, the kind of small, warm evening that reminds you why you keep showing up year after year, even when the family has gotten smaller and quieter and a lot harder to gather in one room. I had set the table myself that morning in the farmhouse my wife Margaret and I bought the year we were married 36 Decembers ago. The long oak table still had the ring on it from when Lillian spilled a glass of cranberry juice at age 7, the stain dark and permanent the way all the best memories of that house had become permanent. I had polished the silverware 3 times, not because it needed it, but because my hands needed something to do that wasn't worry. I had lit the 2 candles in the window because my mother taught me to, and I had put the good cloth napkins in the basket even though nobody really uses cloth napkins anymore. Margaret would have wanted it that way, and I have spent 3 Decembers now trying to give her what she would have wanted, the house being the least of it. My name is Daniel Whitaker, and I am 62 years old, and I am the kind of man who believes that if you build something with your own 2 hands, you have a duty to make sure it ends up in the hands of people who will care for it the way you did. I grew up in rural Pennsylvania in a house my grandfather built with timber he cut himself from the property. And when I was 23, with a freshly minted engineering degree from Penn State and a ring on my finger and a small loan from my father, I bought the old lake place down the road from where I was raised. I poured everything into the business I started out of the garage, Whitaker Structural, and over the years we grew it from a one-man drafting operation to a firm with 43 employees, designing beams and trusses and load-bearing walls for buildings all over the mid-Atlantic. Margaret raised our kids in that house. Lillian, our youngest, was born in the bedroom at the top of the stairs. Dylan, our oldest, learned to ride his bike on the gravel drive before the gravel turned into the asphalt he now parks his truck on. That house is not a building to me. It is the bones of my life. To Margaret, it was the same. We talked about it often in the years before she got sick, that the lake place would one day be divided equally between our 2 children. We both felt strongly about that. She said it out loud on a Sunday morning in October of 2019. Sitting at the breakfast table in a robe, coffee in her hands, our dog underfoot, the lake just visible through the window behind her. She saw it coming even before the diagnosis. She wanted them to know. Margaret died in February of 2022. There is no version of a Christmas since then that has been easy for me, and there is no version of me that would pretend otherwise. The first Christmas, I sat at the table alone. The second Christmas, the year after, Lillian brought her boyfriend, a quiet man named Marcus Adler, who is a pediatric nurse at the Children's Hospital in Pittsburgh. And that was a little warmer, but the chair on my right was still empty, and so it was still lonely in a way that company does not always fix. This Christmas was meant to be a kind of return to form. Dylan and his wife Haley were driving in from Columbus. Lillian and Marcus were coming from the city. My sister Judith, who lives 2 hours north in Scranton, was going to come down with her husband Cliff and their 2 grown daughters, Courtney and Brooke. It would be 10 of us at the table. I bought a fresh 12-pound turkey from the butcher on Main Street. I made Margaret's potato recipe, the one with the cream and the Gruyere and a tiny bit of nutmeg. I made her grandmother's cranberry sauce, the kind that has orange zest in it. I set out the good crystal that my Aunt Loretta left to me in her will. I sent a text the morning of to everyone in the family group, the one I had named Whitaker Christmas 2025, because I cannot bring myself to use the word final anywhere near this house. If I thought about it, I would have done it anyway. Dylan and Haley arrived at 4 in the afternoon, 20 minutes late, which is normal for them. Haley Brennan Whitaker is not the worst daughter-in-law a man could ask for, but she is also not the kind of woman who ever lifted a finger to make anything easier, including her own marriage. She is tall and pretty in the way that comes from discipline rather than from joy, and she has a way of looking around a room as if she is assigning it a value before she sits down. She hugged me, but the hug had a stiffness to it that I clocked but did not name. Dylan hugged me with one arm and immediately walked into the kitchen, opened the fridge, and asked if we had any beer because, quote, the drive was brutal. Dylan is 34. He has a good jaw and his mother's eyes and a habit of treating my house like a hotel. He has worked for me at Whitaker Structural 3 different times over the years. Each time he was let go, fair and square, 2 of them by me and 1 by my partner Ray Chen, who has run operations with me since 1998. He has also worked for a forklift distributor, a roofing outfit, and most recently a company that installs solar panels on commercial buildings. He does not stay anywhere long. He has a habit of blaming everyone but himself for that. Last summer, he told me he had a plan that was going to change things. He did not elaborate. I left it alone. I had been raised by a man who believed in not poking at a sleeping dog. Lillian and Marcus arrived at 6, and with them came the warmth I had been hoping for. Lillian is 29, and she inherited Margaret's steadiness and my contrariness in equal parts, which is to say she is gentle until she is not, and then she is someone you do not want to argue with. She works as a hospice nurse, and she has the kind of face that makes sick people feel calmer just looking at her. Marcus, her boyfriend of 3 years, is a gentle man who has the unusual quality of being a man in 2025 who is not full of himself and does not feel the need to announce every thought that passes through his head. He helped me carry the dishes in from the car. He complimented the cranberry sauce twice. My sister Judith and Cliff rolled in around 6:30 with their 2 girls, Courtney, who is 26 and works at a bank in Philadelphia, and Brooke, who is 24 and just finished her master's in social work. Cliff is a retired firefighter who still has the shoulders of a man who used to run into burning buildings and a voice that carries whether he wants it to or not. Judith has been the most reliable human being I have ever known, and I include my own mother in that statement. We sat down at 7. I said grace, the way my father taught me, short and a little mumbled at the end out of habit. We passed the turkey. I carved it at the table, which is something I took up after Margaret died, because she had always carved and the silence of leaving that role unfilled felt like a worse kind of absence than filling it badly. We talked about the weather, which had turned bitter, and about the dog my sister's neighbor had adopted, and about a recipe Courtney had found for a beet salad that she was planning to try for New Year's. We talked about Lillian's work in the way we always do, careful and a little proud and a little sad. We toasted once with sparkling cider because Judith does not drink, and Cliff is sober 4 years now, and Marcus does not really drink, and it is the kind of family where you ask first. It was sweet and uncomplicated, the kind of toast you give at a family table when the family is, on the surface at least, intact. Then Dylan refilled his glass, stood up at the head of the table near the window, and did something I had not seen him do in a long time. He lifted the glass with both hands the way you do at a wedding. He gave this big smile, his mother's smile, the one that used to make me proud in grade school pictures, and he said, loud enough that everyone had to stop chewing, here is to me finally owning something, to my first real piece of real estate, to the lake house. I put my glass down. I did not do it with force. I did not slam it. I set it carefully back on the table next to my plate so the wine I was not drinking would not spill onto Margaret's linen. I looked at my son. I gave him the look his mother used to give him when he came in past curfew, the look that did not raise its voice because it did not have to. I waited until the table was quiet, until even Judith had stopped her silverware, until Haley's cup was paused halfway to her mouth. I asked him, in the calmest voice I have ever used in my life, because I knew if I lost my voice, I would lose the thread of what was about to happen. Owning what? Exactly, Dylan. Owning what? Dylan laughed. He laughed like I had told a joke. He said, "Come on, Dad. Relax, you know what I mean?" He glanced at Haley, who gave him a small nod that he did not see but I did. He said, "The lake place. The paperwork went through last week. It's mine now, legally. Title is in my name. We are going to renovate in the spring. Haley already has Pinterest boards." I sat there for what felt like a minute, but was probably 10 seconds. I looked across the table at Lillian, who had gone very still. I looked at Judith. I looked at Cliff, who was holding his fork the way Cliff holds things he is about to throw. I looked at the candles in the window. I looked at the ring on the table from the cranberry juice. I asked Dylan slowly where he had gotten the paperwork. He said, "Through a lawyer." He said this in the same breezy way he had asked for the beer. He said, "Haley's cousin works at a title company in Columbus, and they put me in touch with a real estate attorney who specializes in, estate transitions." He said, "It was a smooth process." He said, "I figured you would be happy, Dad. You always said you wanted us to build something of our own." I said, "Did you forge my signature?" He said, "Dad, come on." He said it was a power of attorney. He said, you signed that POA back in 2023, remember, when you had the shoulder surgery. Mom did the same one. He said, Haley's cousin told me that since mom is deceased and you are, getting older, it was a good time to formalize. He said, it's not like I stole it. He said, it's in the family. Then I understood. The shoulder surgery. I had signed a general power of attorney in 2023 to make it easier for Margaret's sister Patricia to handle a few bills while I was in a sling. I had signed it at the kitchen counter on a Wednesday, and I had not thought twice about it. I had read the document. I had not parsed the document. It was a routine thing my lawyer had drawn up. The POA was broad. It gave the agent authority to act on my behalf in a wide range of financial matters. I had appointed Patricia as my agent, not Dylan, never Dylan. What I was beginning to understand, sitting there with my fork in my hand, and the candles burning low and the gravy cooling in the boat, was that someone had used a document I had trusted to pay my electric bill to transfer the deed of the only house my dead wife ever loved from my name to his. And he was toasting it. At my table, in front of her sister. I will not describe to you the next 10 minutes in the detail they deserve, because some of what was said is not mine to repeat. I will tell you what I said and what they said when it mattered, and I will tell you what I did in the days that followed, because that is the part that matters for this story. Cliff stood up from the table and went into the kitchen and came back with his coat on, and he said to Dylan very quietly that if Cliff ever heard Dylan speak like that again about his sister's house, Cliff would not be Cliff about it, meaning that Cliff would become the kind of Cliff he had been on the job when buildings were on fire and people were still inside them. Judith pulled Cliff out by the elbow. Courtney and Brooke left a few minutes later, saying they had an early morning, but the truth was on their faces. Marcus took Lillian into the other room and stayed with her. Haley stood in the hallway with her arms crossed and her eyes wet, and she said, we were trying to help. She said, you don't even use the lake house anymore. She said, it's not like anyone was going to do anything with it. Dylan sat back down in his chair and put his glass on the table the way I had put mine, and he waited for me to speak. I looked at him. I did not raise my voice. I said, that house is not yours. I said, title transfer through a power of attorney that was not granted to you is not ownership. I said, you are not going to renovate it in the spring. I said, you are going to undo what you did, and you are going to do it this week. And if you do not do it this week, I am going to involve people who do not know you and do not care that you are my son. He said, Dad, you are overreacting. He said, we can talk about this. He said, don't be dramatic. I said, Dylan, your mother died in this house. I said, your sister was born in this house. I said, I built my life around this house. I said, you did not build anything. You signed a piece of paper in your cousin-in-law's office, and you poured yourself a glass of wine, and you called it a real estate milestone. He said nothing for a while. Then he said, low, almost to himself, that he had always felt like he had to fight for everything in this family, that Lillian was the favorite, that I had never trusted him with anything important, that the business had been kept from him even when he begged to be let in. He said, maybe if you had given me a real chance, I would not have had to do this. He said, this is mine now, Dad, legally. He said, get used to it. I said, get out of my house. He got out of my house. Haley got out of my house. They drove away in their truck, which was a leased Ford F-150, which he had told me proudly 6 months earlier he had financed with no money down. Lillian came back into the dining room 20 minutes later. She sat down across from me. She put her hand on mine. She said, Dad, what he did is a crime. She said, it is called exploitation of a vulnerable adult through a power of attorney obtained under false pretenses. She said, I looked it up while we were in the other room. She said, the POA was not even transferable. He could not have used Patricia's authority even if he had been Patricia. He impersonated the agent. I sat for a long time. The turkey was cold. The candles had burned down to stubs. Cliff was in the kitchen washing dishes in silence, because Cliff cannot sit still when there is a wrong in a room. Judith was on the phone in the hall. I made a phone call of my own to my lawyer, a man named Aaron Goldstein who has handled my affairs since the 90s. I told him what had happened. He was quiet for a moment. He said, Daniel, do not speak to your son about this again. Do not reply to texts. Do not let him in the house if he shows up. He said, this is going to get messy. I slept about 2 hours that night. The next morning I wrote down, in a small notebook I keep by the phone, every detail I could remember. I wrote down that the POA was filed in 2023 for the purpose of bill management during a shoulder surgery. I wrote down that Patricia, my wife's sister, was the named agent, and she still lives in Asheville, and as far as I know, she has never received a notice of any kind. I wrote down that Dylan said there was a title company in Columbus involved and that the deed had been changed last week. I wrote down what Dylan had said at the table. I wrote down what Haley had said in the hall. I wrote down what Lillian had said about exploitation of a vulnerable adult. I wrote down the date, December 25, 2025. I wrote down the time. I underlined it. I am an engineer by training, and my memory is good, but you do not build buildings without paperwork, and you do not fight crimes against your family without paperwork either. On the 26th, I drove to the courthouse in the county seat. I requested a copy of the most recent deed on the lake property. The clerk, an older woman who has known my family for 30 years, raised her eyebrows when she pulled the file. She said, "Daniel, this was recorded 11 days ago." She said it was signed by someone named Patricia Calhoun as your agent under a durable power of attorney dated October 2023. She said, "Do you know this, Patricia?" I said, "That would be my late wife's sister." Patricia has not been in this house in 3 years. Patricia has not signed a document in this state in 3 years. Patricia, last I knew, was dealing with her own husband's ongoing illness and rarely leaves the house she has in North Carolina. The clerk copied the deed for me, and I drove it straight to Aaron's office. Aaron is a man in his late 60s with a snowy beard and a habit of taking his glasses off when he is about to say something he means. He took his glasses off. He said, "Daniel, your son committed document fraud and possibly forgery and probably wire fraud related to the title transfer." He said he did not just take your house. He took the title insurance policy with his cousin's company and he filed a fraudulent transfer. He said, "I am going to file a police report today. I am also going to file civil action to set aside the transfer and to recover damages." He said, "Are you prepared? Because once we file, the family will not be the same." I sat in his office and I looked at him. I said, "Aaron, the family died on Christmas." I said, "Whatever you need to do to make this right, do it." In the days that followed, I learned a number of things I did not know. I learned that Dylan had been planning this for at least a year. He had been in communication with a real estate attorney in Columbus named Virgil Tomlin, who specializes in estate transitions and has a reputation among people I spoke with later as someone who operates in the gray. I learned that Virgil had approached Patricia by phone, claiming to be calling from my lawyer's office, and had walked Patricia through a verification step, in which she was told she was confirming her own information. Patricia, who was tired and grieving and not a lawyer, had given verbal authorizations she did not understand. I learned that Virgil had used those verbal authorizations, combined with what appears to be a stolen copy of the original POA, to draw up a new deed transferring title to Dylan. I learned that the cousin at the title company in Columbus had filed the deed in this county under expedited recording, and that the recording happened on December 14th, 11 days before Christmas. I learned that the cousin's name is Dana Brennan, and that Dana is Haley's first cousin, and that Dana had a financial interest in the title transfer going through because apparently Dana gets a fee on every transfer her office processes in connection with Virgil. I learned that Dylan had been telling people for weeks that he was about to come into something significant, that he had told 2 of his old coworkers and a friend from college, and that he had, on December 22nd, 3 days before Christmas, texted his mother-in-law Carol Brennan in Columbus a message that said simply, "It is happening," and that Carol had replied with a single thumbs-up emoji. I learned that Haley had been the one who picked the lawyer. I learned that Haley had been the one who came up with the phrase "first real estate." I learned that Haley had been the one who selected the Pinterest boards. I will tell you what I did not learn. I did not learn that Dylan ever regretted anything. He did not call. He did not apologize. He did not come by the house. He sent a text to Lillian on December 29th that said in its entirety, "Tell Dad the deal is fair. Tell him I will give him $150,000 and he can stay in the main house for as long as he wants." He said the lake property value is about $800,000. He said he was being generous. Lillian did not reply. She texted me a screenshot and then she called me and then she said, "Dad, do not engage." She said, "Let Aaron handle it." I did not engage. I did not engage all the way through New Year's. I spent New Year's Eve at the kitchen table alone with a bowl of Margaret's potato recipe leftovers and a beer I had not opened, and I watched the countdown on the small television in the corner where I had set it up because Cliff had asked for it before Cliff left on Christmas night. I did not engage because Aaron had been very specific. He had said, "Silence is also evidence, Daniel. Let your son build his narrative. We will dismantle it in court, not at your dinner table." In the second week of January, I received a letter in the mail from a law firm in Columbus I had never heard of. The letter was on heavy stock and was addressed to me in a font that felt like it was trying to befriend me. The letter said that their client, Dylan Whitaker, was offering to settle the dispute over the lake property by paying me the sum of $175,000, The fair market value minus improvements and minus an adjustment for what the letter described, without any irony, as the previous emotional use of the property by my immediate family. The letter said, "The offer is generous under the circumstances." The letter said, "Our client has obtained title through lawful means and through proper legal channels." The letter said, "Please be advised that further defamation or interference with our client's title could result in counteraction." The letter was signed by an associate named Brianna Hutcherson, who I later learned had been at Virgil Tomlin's firm for 4 months. I called Aaron from the kitchen. I read him the letter over the phone. He laughed in the way Aaron laughs when he knows he has the other side by the throat. He said, "Save the envelope." He said, "We will attach it to the complaint." He said, "They are building my case for me, Daniel." He said, "The only thing I need from you now is patience and a list of every conversation you have had about this with anyone." By the end of January, Aaron had filed the police report with the county. The detective assigned was a woman named Sergeant Ramirez, who was not unkind, but who was also not someone you wanted to disappoint. She called me in for an interview, and I brought my little notebook, and I told her everything. She took notes. She asked me about Patricia. She asked me about Virgil. She asked me about Dana. She said, "These things are not quick, Mr. Whitaker." She said, "We will be in touch." In February, I received a separate call from the State Attorney General's office. A man named Trent Albright, who works in the Elder Protection Unit, asked me to come in. The office was in Harrisburg, 2 hours south of me. I drove down on a Tuesday. Trent was younger than I expected, and serious in the way people who handle elder exploitation cases tend to be. He showed me a printout of the deed. He said, "Mr. Whitaker, I want to walk you through what we believe happened, and I want to walk you through your options." He said, "The state is also opening an investigation into Virgil Tomlin and into Dana Brennan." He said, "We do not believe this is the first time this particular group has pulled this kind of transfer." I sat with Trent in his office for 2 hours. I drank bad coffee. He asked me about my relationship with my son. I told him what I have told you, which is that he is my son and I love him, and that love does not make me unable to recognize what he has done. He said, "A lot of families in your situation do not want to pursue criminal charges." He said, "Are you prepared for this to go to trial?" He said, "Are you prepared for your son to be charged?" I said, "Trent, my son made a choice." I said, "I made my choice when I was 23 and bought that place." I said, "He made his on December 14th. Trent said, "Okay." He said, "We will be in touch." In March, Aaron moved for an emergency injunction to freeze the property. The judge, Honorable Caroline Fitch, granted it within 48 hours because the evidence of fraud was on the face of the recorded documents. Aaron attached the police report. Aaron attached the affidavit from Patricia she had signed under oath after Aaron contacted her. Aaron attached the letter from Virgil's firm that threatened me for defamation, which was the kind of self-inflicted wound only an arrogant man could deliver. The injunction did not just freeze the property. It froze Virgil's practice. It froze Dana's title company pending review. That is when Dylan started calling. He did not call me. He called Lillian. He called Cliff. He called Judith. He called Haley's parents. He called my old partner Ray. He called my college roommate, a man named Phil Anders who lives in Boise and who I have not spoken to in 11 years, just to ask Phil to tell me he was sorry. He did not call me. He did not call me because Aaron had been very specific with me. He had said, "If your son calls you, do not pick up." He had said, "If he shows up, call me." He had said, "If he sends a message, save it." He had said, "Every word he says from this point forward is going into the record, whether he knows it or not." I did not pick up. I did not call back. I did not engage. What broke me, in the end, was not Dylan. It was not Haley. It was not Virgil. It was not even the weight of the legal proceedings. What broke me was a Saturday morning in mid-March when I went out to the lake. I had not been to the lake place since the news. I did not want to go. I made myself. I parked in the gravel drive and I sat in the truck for 10 minutes. I walked to the water. The dock was the same dock. The chairs on the dock were the chairs Margaret had bought at a yard sale in 2010. The rope swing was still there, the one I had hung for Dylan when he was 8, the one I had replaced the rope on every spring because ropes on trees are not built to last. I stood at the edge of the water and I put my hand on the post. I sat down in one of the chairs. I closed my eyes. I sat there for an hour. I did not think about Dylan. I did not think about Virgil. I did not think about the injunction. I thought about Margaret, who had taught the kids to swim off this dock. I thought about Lillian, who had caught her first fish off this dock. I thought about Cliff, who had once dove off this dock drunk and had scraped his chin open and had bled into the water and had laughed about it for 15 years. I thought about how the family was before it became a thing I had to defend. When I opened my eyes, I noticed something I had not noticed before. There were new construction stakes in the yard. There was a flag on a stake that said, in plastic printed letters, Expansion Survey, with a company name I did not recognize and a number from Columbus. There was a small sign on a stake about 30 feet from the water that said, Proposed Retaining Wall. There were markings in the dirt that suggested someone had been walking the property with measuring tape. Dylan, or someone Dylan had hired, had been surveying for a renovation. He had been planning to bulldoze the willow tree Margaret planted for Dylan's birth in 1991. He had been planning to rebuild the dock. He had been planning to add a retaining wall in front of the place where I had spread a small amount of Margaret's ashes in 2022. Because she had said she wanted to be near the water, and I had not told anyone that I had done this except Lillian, who had helped me. I drove home. I sat at the kitchen table. I called Aaron. I told him what I had seen. He was quiet. He said, Daniel, I am going to add trespassing and attempted destruction of a protected site to the criminal referral. He said, Are you sure about the ashes? I said, I am sure. He said, Okay. He said, Hold on. I held on. Aaron called the detective. Aaron called Trent. Aaron called the State Historic Preservation Office because the lake property is on a registry of properties associated with the original settlement of the county in the 1700s, which Aaron had researched because Aaron is thorough. By April, the survey stakes were pulled out by court order. In April, Dylan was arrested. I will tell you about it carefully because it is the part of this story I am least able to discuss without getting up from the table. He was arrested at his home in Columbus on a Wednesday morning by Sergeant Ramirez and 2 other officers. He was arraigned the next day by Judge Fitch on charges including forgery, fraud in the acquisition of real property, exploitation of an elderly person, identity theft, criminal trespass, and a handful of related charges. The bond was set at $250,000, which Dylan could not afford, and he sat in the county jail for a week until Haley's parents posted a portion of it, with the help of a bail bondsman named Wendell Pace, who advertises heavily on Columbus television. I did not go to the arraignment. I did not want to be in the room. I sat in the kitchen. Lillian sat with me. Marcus made tea. Judith called every hour. In May, Virgil Tomlin was charged separately with multiple counts of fraud and with conspiracy to commit elder exploitation, in connection with 6 other families, none of whom I knew personally, but several of whom I had begun to hear from through letters forwarded to me by Trent, including a woman named Eleanor Pritchard, whose husband had been a longtime friend of mine from church and who had lost her home of 46 years to a similar scheme before she even realized what had happened, and a man named Otis Lehman whose wife had Alzheimer's and whose son had done essentially the same thing Dylan had done to me, with Virgil's help. The pattern was the same. A distant relative, a forged or manipulated POA, a rushed recording, an offer to settle, a quiet buyer lined up by Virgil's office, and a check cut before the family even knew what had happened. Trent told me that they believed they had identified at least 12 families, possibly more, and that the case was going to be a major prosecution. In May, I received a letter from Virgil's old firm, this time on regular paper, with no Brianna Hutcherson's signature, apologizing for the previous letter and asking for a meeting to discuss settlement. I forwarded it to Aaron unopened. In June, Dana Brennan's title company was shut down by state order. A receiver was appointed. A woman named Marilyn Suggs from the state insurance department called to tell me that Dana had been fined and that her license had been revoked. I did not feel the satisfaction I thought I would feel. I felt tired. Dylan fired his first attorney in May and hired a new one, a man named Russell Carrington, who comes from a well-known firm in Cleveland and who has the kind of soft face that suggests he is good in front of a jury. Russell called Aaron in July to introduce himself. Aaron told me. Russell asked if Dylan could meet with me in person with no lawyers, just the 2 of us, so he could apologize. I said no. I said, Russell, my son is welcome to apologize under oath in a courtroom, where it counts. Russell was quiet. He said, your son is devastated. I said, he should be. In July, Lily and Marcus came over for a cookout. It was the first time in 7 months I had the energy to fire up the grill. Marcus cut up a watermelon. Lillian brought a pie from a bakery in Pittsburgh. Judith and Cliff came down for the day. Courtney called from Philadelphia to say she was proud of me. Brooke texted me a single heart emoji, which is more feeling than she normally expresses in a calendar year. We sat on the porch. I did not talk about the case. I talked about the weather, about the garden Lillian had helped me plant, about the church fundraiser coming up in August, about Cliff's new fishing boat, about Marcus's idea to put a little library on a post by the front walk. For one afternoon, I was not a man being stolen from. I was just a man with his family. That is what I have lost. That is the part nobody talks about. When you build something and someone takes it from you under cover of law and then hides behind a letter on heavy stock, the thing you lose is not the deed. The thing you lose is the room where you would have been sitting with your grandchildren on a Sunday afternoon in October with coffee in your hands. The thing you lose is the kind of afternoon where the biggest decision is whether to make a second pot. Dylan is scheduled for trial in October. The plea negotiations have been going on since June. The latest offer, conveyed to Aaron in August, is that Dylan will plead guilty to a reduced set of charges and serve a minimum of 3 years in a state correctional facility with restitution, with a permanent bar on holding real estate or fiduciary positions, and with a structured no-contact order that includes me, Margaret's sister Patricia, and the rest of the family. Haley has not been charged. She has not been cleared. Trent told me that there is an active review of her involvement, that she is being treated as a co-conspirator in the civil action, but that criminal charges for her are pending the outcome of her cooperation. The last piece of paper that came from her was a notarized letter in July, drafted by Russell, in which she said she was sorry and that she had not understood what was happening at the time, and that she had been afraid of Dylan and that she wanted to make it right. I do not know if any of that is true. Lillian says she suspects it is not. Marcus says it does not matter whether it is true. Aaron says it will matter to a jury if it ever gets that far. I still live in the farmhouse. The lake place still has my name on it, with the injunction corrected. The POA has been revoked. I have a new will, drawn up by Aaron and witnessed by Cliff and by Lillian. It splits the property equally between my children, as Margaret and I always intended, but with a specific provision that if any heir is found at any point to have committed fraud, theft, or abuse against an elder in connection with the estate, that heir forfeits their share, which is then redirected to a trust that funds elder protection legal aid in Pennsylvania. There is a provision in my will that names the woman from church, Eleanor Pritchard, as a beneficiary of a small annual gift from that trust, in case her own case has gone the way it sometimes goes, which is badly. There is a provision that names Cliff as my executor. There is a provision that specifies who may and may not attend my funeral. Dylan is on the second list. Cliff is on the first. I do not know if Dylan will be at Christmas this year. He is currently out on bond, living with Haley's parents in Columbus, and the no-contact order is in place. But I have begun, in the last few weeks, to think about a question Aaron asked me in July that I have not yet been able to answer. He asked me in his office, with his glasses in his hand, whether I believed there was a path back. He did not say back to what. He did not say whether it would be best for the family or for me. He did not say whether it would make anything right. He asked me whether I believed it was possible, on any terms, for a father and a son to undo something like this. I have thought about it every day since. I have not come up with an answer. I do not know if I will ever come up with an answer. I do know that I asked Dylan on December 25th, with the candles burning and the turkey cold and the gravy in the boat, one question, and that question was owning what exactly? And that question is the question I am still asking. I do not know what this Christmas will hold. I do not know if Dylan will reach out. I do not know if Haley will reach out. I do not know if Patricia will come up from Asheville with her husband and sit at my table and look at me with Margaret's eyes and tell me she is sorry she did not see what they made her do. I do not know if I will sit alone at the table again. I do not know if I will sit with Lillian and Marcus and Judith and Cliff and the rest of the family the way we sat on the porch in July with the watermelon and the pie and the good afternoon light. I do not know if I will open a bottle of Margaret's favorite wine, which I have kept in a closet for 3 years, on a night that earns it. What I do know is this. The lake house has my name on it now. And for the first time since Christmas, the name on the deed feels less important to me than the name on the people who showed up for me when it mattered. Lillian showed up. Judith showed up. Cliff showed up. Marcus showed up. Ray Chen sent me a handwritten note that I keep in the kitchen drawer because it is the kind of thing you keep. Sergeant Ramirez called me in May just to check in, which is more than any detective has ever done for me in my life, and which surprised me in the way a small kindness surprises a man who has just been reminded how few of them exist in certain rooms. I asked Dylan a question at Christmas dinner. He answered it. The answer was the worst thing I have ever heard at my own table. The glass I put down did not break. It is still in the cabinet. I have not used it since. Tomorrow it will be Christmas again, and I will set the table again, and I will say grace in my father's mumbling voice, and I will carve the turkey, and I will pass the cranberry sauce, and I will lift a glass, and I will not toast to owning something. I will toast, if I toast at all, to the people still sitting in their chairs. Story 2. My sister told everyone I had become too old to manage our family business. Then the accountant slid a folder across the table. The first time I heard my sister tell someone I was getting too old to. Keep up. She was standing in our showroom in Dublin, Ohio, holding a latte and smiling at a couple picking out faucets for a remodel like she was on HGTV. I had just come back from the warehouse because one of our delivery guys had called off and the Moen order for a builder in Powell was short 2 boxes. I walked in through the back, still wearing my black quarter zip with dust on the sleeve, and heard my sister Lauren laugh and say, Susan knows the business, obviously, but at a certain point you need energy and a more modern approach. The couple looked awkward. Lauren noticed me half a second later and did that fake bright thing she does where her whole face changes. There she is, she said. We were just talking about how nobody knows inventory like you. That was the start of it, at least the part I could hear out loud. I'm 58. My sister is 51. Our family business is a kitchen and bath supply company my dad started in 1989 with one counter, a borrowed forklift, and a line of credit my mother still talks about like it was a war story. By the time all of this happened, we had 2 showrooms, a warehouse, 12 full-time employees, and a steady stream of contractors, remodelers, and homeowners who had been using us for years. Not a huge company, not some empire, but enough that it mattered. Enough people's mortgages depended on it. I started there when I was 24 because Dad's bookkeeper quit during tax season and he needed help. I was supposed to stay 6 months, then I stayed 34 years. Lauren came in much later after a real estate stint, a boutique fitness obsession, and a very expensive year where she decided she might become an interior designer if she found the right creative container, which is exactly the kind of phrase she likes to use. Dad gave her the showroom side because she was good with people and good in front of a camera. She could sell a woman on a $4,000 tub she did not need and make her feel empowered for buying it. I'll give her that. She was charming, she was polished, she always looked like she had somewhere nicer to be. I was the one who handled operations, vendors, payroll approvals, delivery schedules, insurance renewals, installer disputes, contractor accounts, and all the boring things that actually keep a business upright. Dad used to say Lauren knew how to make money come in and I knew how to stop it leaking out. It sounds nice when I put it that way. In reality, it meant she got the pretty half and I got the half where people yelled. When Dad got sick, that division got sharper. He had a stroke in late 2021. He survived, but it changed him. He couldn't work, and even before that, he had been slowing down. During that year, I basically moved into the office. I was there at 6:45 every morning and sometimes still answering vendor emails at 10:30 at night from my couch with my reading glasses sliding down my nose. My daughter, Emma, who is 27 and works in nonprofit fundraising in Chicago, kept telling me I needed boundaries. I remember laughing at her because the business was the boundary. It contained everything. Lauren showed up when there was something visible to do. She'd host designer brunches in the showroom with little charcuterie cups and branded napkins. She wanted us on Instagram more. She wanted a refresh of the logo, new paint, better lighting, a social media manager, stronger brand storytelling. Some of that was probably true. Some of it was also a way to spend money while I was negotiating freight costs and trying to keep our installers from quitting. Dad passed in spring of 2023. He left the company split between us equally, but the operating agreement named me managing member. That was his wording, not mine. He said it was because I had been there from the beginning and knew the whole machine. He also said, in one of the last clear conversations we had, your sister wants the wheel but not the road. I never repeated that to Lauren because I'm not cruel, and because even then I was still trying to believe we could do this together. We couldn't. At first it was little comments. She'd say I was old school in front of staff, which was meant as a joke until it wasn't. She'd forward me articles about AI scheduling tools and CRM dashboards with notes like, we can't get left behind. She started using phrases like succession planning, which was funny because I'm 7 years older than she is, not 30. Then it got more pointed. At my nephew Tyler's graduation party, I was standing on my brother-in-law's deck in New Albany, holding a paper plate with a dried-out burger on it, When Lauren told our cousin Denise that I had been forgetting things lately and maybe it was time to let go with dignity. She said it in that soft, sympathetic voice people use when they want to sound concerned while planting a bomb. I hadn't been forgetting things. I had missed one lunch because she had changed the calendar invite from 12:30 to 11:30 and never texted me. When I walked into the restaurant late, she was already there with the rep from Delta and two contractors, and she gave me this tiny sad smile like I was somebody's confused aunt. At the time, I thought it was a miscommunication. Later, after everything came out, I stopped giving people the benefit of the doubt so easily. She also began having private meetings with a few of our employees, especially the younger ones. Kayla, our showroom manager, told me about it eventually, but at first she was uncomfortable. Lauren would take her to North Star and talk about the future of the company. She'd say things like, "When leadership transitions, I want people like you closer to the center." She told our warehouse lead, Mike, that we needed someone faster and more digital at the top. She told one of our outside sales guys that I was resistant to change because I still used a paper planner. I do still use a paper planner. I also know our margins down to the decimal and can spot a bad contractor account from 3 sentences into a phone call. So I didn't realize Moleskines were disqualifying now. What made it harder is that some of it sounded plausible if you didn't know the full picture. I had had a knee replacement the year before. I don't post online. I don't like Zoom when a phone call works faster. I was tired all the time after Dad died. Grief ages you in the face before it does anywhere else. Lauren, meanwhile, had blowouts twice a week, white sneakers that never somehow got dirty, and the kind of fitted blazers that make people assume competence before you've opened your mouth. Our mother did not help. Mom is 79, still sharp, still living in the house in Upper Arlington where we grew up, and still capable of making me feel 15 with one sigh. She has always adored whatever version of Lauren is in front of her. To Mom, Lauren is dynamic. To me, Lauren is exhausting. Those are not mutually exclusive. The first time Mom repeated the too old narrative to my face, it was over lunch at Houlihan's. She stirred her iced tea and said, "Honey, nobody is saying you're incapable. But maybe Lauren is more current." I asked her what current meant. She said, technology, presentation, energy. I said, "I'm 58, Mom, not dead." She looked offended, like I had made it vulgar. By that fall, Lauren had started talking openly about bringing in her husband Todd in a larger role. Todd is one of those men who has read 3 airport business books and now thinks every conversation needs a whiteboard. He spent most of his career in medical device sales, did well enough, and golfed with exactly the kind of men who say moving the needle without irony. He started coming around the showroom more. Not to lift a finger, obviously. Just to stand near the coffee station and ask leading questions about inventory turn and brand alignment. He once told me in my own office that family businesses fail because founders' kids confuse longevity with vision. I said, "That's interesting, Todd, especially from a man whose wife orders custom candles on the company card." He laughed like I was joking. I was not joking. That brings me to the financial stuff, because even before the meeting, I knew something was off. I didn't know how off. We'd had a strong spring, but cash felt tighter than it should have. Not crisis level tight, but enough that I was watching it. Freight costs were higher, yes. We had done a small showroom update Lauren pushed hard for, yes. But there were also odd reimbursements, vague marketing invoices, and recurring payments I didn't fully recognize. When I asked Lauren, she always had an answer ready. It was a photographer. It was a consultant. It was SEO. It was a customer event expense. It was a software integration fee. She did say these things fast and with mild annoyance, like I was proving her point by asking. Now, I'm not an accountant, but I'm not stupid either. Our CPA, Harold Keene, had handled our books and taxes since the Clinton administration. Harold is the kind of man who still wears short-sleeved dress shirts with a tie in July and writes numbers in tiny, neat handwriting. He doesn't overreact. He barely reacts at all. If Harold raises an eyebrow, something is wrong. In January of last year, he called me and asked if I had time to stop by his office. I remember the weather because it was gray in that very Ohio way where the sky looks like dirty wool. I drove over thinking it was tax planning or maybe payroll changes. Harold had a legal pad in front of him and 3 printouts clipped together. He said, "I'm seeing some entries I can't reconcile cleanly." I've asked Lauren for support twice. That was the first chill. I asked what entries. He turned the papers toward me. There were monthly payments to something called North Loop Strategy LLC. Not huge on their own, but enough to matter. There were also elevated marketing reimbursements and what looked like travel expenses coded to vendor development. Harold said Lauren had described North Loop as a consulting firm, helping with our digital expansion. I said I'd never heard of them. Harold did that eyebrow thing. I asked if he thought this was sloppiness or something worse. He said very carefully, "I think it's worth looking at before assumptions harden in any direction." That sentence stuck with me because it was such Harold wording. He wasn't accusing. He was telling me not to be naive. I asked Lauren about North Loop that night. We were in the office kitchen, and she was pouring oat milk into coffee like an ad for herself. She didn't even blink. She said Todd had connected her with them through a branding contact in Chicago, and they were helping optimize our online funnels. I told her Harold needed backup. She rolled her eyes and said Harold was wonderful, but not exactly fluent in modern growth strategy. That line alone nearly made me throw something. Still, I did what I have done my whole life. I swallowed my irritation and kept moving. Over the next 2 months, the campaign against me sped up. Lauren told 2 vendors that I was thinking about retirement, which was news to me. She asked our attorney, Melissa Grant, whether the company bylaws allowed a leadership restructuring for the health of the business. Melissa called me after and said, "Just so you know, your sister is asking weirdly specific questions." Then Lauren announced we needed a family and leadership alignment meeting in March. That was her phrase. She sent a calendar invite to me, Mom, Todd, Melissa, Harold, and our 2 senior managers, Mike and Kayla. She also copied our cousin Denise, who does nothing for the company but loves being near drama, which told me exactly what kind of meeting this was going to be. The invite said, "Strategic direction and executive transition discussion." I stared at the screen long enough that my coffee went cold. My daughter Emma happened to FaceTime me that night while I was still at my kitchen island with my laptop open. She took one look at my face and said, "What did Aunt Lauren do now?" I read her the subject line. Emma actually laughed. "Executive transition? She talks like a LinkedIn post." Then she got serious and said, "Mom, stop trying to handle her like she's normal. She's building a story about you." That hurt because I knew she was right. The week before the meeting was one of the ugliest of my life. Not because of one big thing, but because of all the little humiliations. A contractor I've known for 15 years asked me if I was stepping back a bit. A rep from Kohler told me Lauren had mentioned the next generation of leadership, which was especially insulting since there is no next generation involved unless my sister planned to let her golden retriever run accounts payable. Mom called and suggested I might think about a graceful role shift, and when I asked if she realized Lauren was only 7 years younger than me, Mom said that wasn't the point. Everything started to feel surreal, like I was being edged out of my own life by a rumor. I barely slept the night before the meeting. I woke up at 4:12 a.m., made coffee, and sat in the dark in my robe listening to my refrigerator hum. I kept thinking about Dad, about how he used to come into my office and toss a pack of peanut M&Ms on my desk after rough mornings, about how furious he would have been to see what was happening. Then I'd get angry at myself for even needing his memory as backup. I had run that company for years. I knew what I had done. Why was I sitting in my kitchen like I was about to defend my sanity? The meeting was set for 10 o'clock in our upstairs conference room overlooking the showroom. Lauren had catered pastries from Fox in the Snow and arranged bottled sparkling water at each seat like we were negotiating a merger. She was wearing cream slacks and a navy blouse and looked almost excited. Todd was there too, leaning back in his chair with that self-satisfied expression men get when they think they are about to witness a management correction. Harold came in last, carrying a leather portfolio and one of those plain manila folders so overstuffed the clasp barely held. I noticed it because Harold never carries extra paper unless he needs it. Lauren started the meeting. Of course she did. She thanked everyone for making time. She said the business was at an inflection point. She said customers were changing, markets were changing, leadership needed to evolve, and hard conversations were part of responsible stewardship. It was all very polished. She had printed packets. She actually had a slide deck on the TV screen with our logo in the corner. Then she looked directly at me and did the thing I will probably hear in my head for the rest of my life. "Susan," she said in this slow, careful voice, "you have given decades to this company, and no one can take that away from you. But I think we all need to be honest that the business may have outgrown your management style. This isn't about blame, it's about capacity. Capacity. Not experience, not performance. Capacity." Like I was a battery losing charge. I remember my face feeling hot. Mike looked down at the table. Kayla went very still. Mom looked miserable but said nothing, which somehow made it worse. Todd folded his hands like we were in church. Lauren kept going. She talked about response times, missed opportunities, digital lag, confusion around vendor initiatives. She said the company needed stronger executive energy. She used the words transition, advisory role, and dignity in the same 5 minutes. Then she said, "I think everyone here has noticed Susan slowing down, even if nobody has wanted to say it." That was the part that almost broke me. Not because it was true, but because it was such a naked attempt to manufacture consensus. She didn't say, I think. She said, everyone here. I opened my mouth, but before I could say anything, Harold cleared his throat. It wasn't loud. Harold never needs to be loud. He just said, before we discuss any change in management, I think everyone should review the financial packet I prepared. Lauren's face changed for the first time. Harold reached into his portfolio, pulled out copies, and slid the main folder across the table toward the center. It made this soft scraping sound on the wood. For some reason, that sound is what I remember most clearly. Not Lauren's speech, not my own pulse in my ears, just that folder sliding between the water bottles. He handed packets to Melissa's, Mom, Mike, Kayla, and me. Todd tried to lean over Lauren's shoulder immediately, and she put a hand on the papers like she could stop them from existing. Harold said, over the past quarter, I was asked to review irregular expenditures, approval pathways, and discrepancies in reporting. What I found raises serious concerns. Nobody said a word. Inside the packet were bank records, expense reports, audit logs from our accounting software, reimbursement forms, vendor contracts, and highlighted notes in Harold's tiny handwriting. Page 1 was North Loop Strategy LLC. Page 2 showed the LLC registration tied to Todd's home address, not Chicago, not some outside consultant, Todd's address. There had been monthly payments for 11 months. Todd went red so fast it was almost impressive. Page 3 was a series of reimbursements Lauren had coded to client development that included spa services in Scottsdale, first-class airfare for a design market trip where there was no registered market attendance, and a hotel bill that included minibar charges so ridiculous I almost laughed despite everything. There were also invoices for branded merchandise that never arrived at our office, a floral subscription charged to showroom staging that was being delivered to Lauren's house, and a lease payment for an apartment near Ohio State that had been entered as corporate housing for visiting talent. Visiting talent was our niece Chloe, Lauren's daughter, who was 22 and had moved out after college because she wanted to experience city living on somebody else's money. Then there was payroll. Not fake employees exactly, but close enough. Todd had been receiving consulting payments with no contract approved by me. Chloe had been on payroll part-time as a social media assistant while living in that apartment and posting almost exclusively mirror selfies and rooftop drinks. A guy in Denver named Mason Briggs had been receiving monthly payments for e-commerce optimization. Harold's notes showed Mason Briggs was Lauren's friend from her Peloton group who had no actual deliverables on file. I felt physically cold reading it. But the worst part, the part that changed the whole room, was the system audit log. Harold had pulled a record of who had approved, edited, and reclassified certain entries. Several of the vendor timing mistakes Lauren had used to suggest I was slipping had been created under her login. She had moved due dates, changed coding, and in 2 cases deleted notification trails, then later brought up the resulting confusion as evidence that operations were falling apart. One page had an email chain where she told our bookkeeper Sandra, let's keep this under marketing for now. Susan gets reactive when she sees big picture investments without context. Sandra, bless her, had replied, shouldn't Susan sign off? She's managing member. Lauren wrote back, I'll handle Susan. That was in black and white in front of God and everybody. Melissa, our attorney, was flipping pages with the expression of someone discovering a gas leak in her own kitchen. Mike let out a low Jesus Christ before catching himself. Kayla looked like she might cry. Mom put both hands over her mouth. Lauren tried to speak twice before words came out. The first thing she said was, this is being completely mischaracterized. Harold, still calm, said, the documents speak for themselves. Todd jumped in and said North Loop was real strategic work. Harold asked for deliverables. Todd said strategy isn't always linear. Melissa looked at him like she wanted to staple his tie to the table. Lauren turned to me then, which I found amazing. Not to explain, to accuse. She said, so this is what you've been doing? Building a case against me? I actually laughed and it sounded awful, like something cracked. I said, Lauren, you told people I was too old to run the business while you were billing your daughter's apartment to company housing. Mom started crying at that point. Quiet crying, which is somehow worse. Lauren said Chloe needed the apartment because she was helping with content creation in the city. I asked what city exactly, since our business is in Columbus and Chloe's biggest documented contribution had been taking photos of herself with oversized coffee cups. Todd said I was being petty. Mike muttered petty under his breath. Then Melissa asked the question that really ended it. She said, Lauren, did you or did you not authorize payments to an LLC tied to your husband without disclosing the relationship to the managing member? Lauren said, I didn't think it mattered because we were all family. Melissa said, it matters. Silence again. It would be nice if I could tell you I handled the rest with icy grace. I didn't. I was furious. Years of swallowing things came out all at once. I told Lauren she had spent a year trying to make me look senile because it was easier than admitting she wanted control and had already been taking money. I told Todd he had no business coming into my office throwing around strategy jargon while using our company like his weekend venture fund. I told Mom that staying neutral while one daughter publicly smeared the other was not neutrality. Nobody looked at me while I said the part about Mom. That one landed hard. Lauren cried then, but not in a way that made me feel anything. She cried like a person outraged to be cornered by consequences. She kept saying she had grown the brand, she had brought value, she had done things I didn't understand because I was stuck in old systems. Imagine being caught with your hand in the register and still trying to make it about innovation. Harold had totals. Of course he had totals. Between direct questionable payments, personal expenses, undisclosed related party consulting, and payroll misuse, we were looking at just over $184,000 over 11 months. Not all of it legally provable as theft in the strictest sense, according to Melissa, but enough to support immediate removal from financial authority and likely civil action. Lauren looked stunned by the number, which told me she genuinely had not been keeping track. That, more than anything, summed her up. She never thought in totals. She thought in moments. One trip, one invoice, one investment, one thing she felt entitled to because the business was doing fine and because she believed she was the kind of person those things belonged to. Melissa ended the meeting in lawyer mode. She said Lauren's access to company accounts, cards, payroll approvals, and software would be suspended immediately. Todd was not to represent himself as affiliated in any operational or consulting capacity. We would conduct a fuller forensic review. She advised everyone at the table not to delete any communications or records. Mike left to get IT on speaker so we could lock Lauren's credentials before she made it downstairs. That was the most humiliating part for her, I think. Not being caught. Being escorted administratively out of power in real time. Lauren stood up so fast her chair scraped. She said this was a witch hunt, that Harold was old-fashioned, that I had always resented her, that Dad had favored me, and this was just the latest example. Then she looked at Mom and said, "You're really going to let her do this?" Mom, still crying, said, "I didn't know." Lauren said, "Of course you knew. You always know everything." Then she grabbed her bag and left. Todd followed, but not before saying to me, "This isn't over." I said, "No kidding." After they left, the room kind of collapsed in on itself. Mike swore softly and asked if payroll was safe. Kayla asked whether the staff knew anything yet. Harold took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose like the world was exhausting him on a molecular level. Mom kept saying, "How could she do this? How could she do this?" As if asking it enough times would turn it into a useful question. I just sat there staring at the highlighted line for the apartment lease because it was so insultingly specific. Not even subtle. My sister had basically been funding her daughter's cute little post-college downtown life while telling people I didn't have the energy to run a company. The rest of that week was a blur of damage control. We met with our bank, we reviewed every company card. Sandra, our bookkeeper, gave Melissa every email she had saved because, in her words, I always thought something felt weird. We changed passwords, approval chains, and access levels. I had to sit down with our staff and explain enough without saying too much. That meeting was one of the hardest parts because people had heard things. Office people always hear things. I told them there had been financial irregularities under review, that outside counsel was involved, and that operations would continue normally. Mike later told me half the warehouse had already guessed Lauren was behind something because she never asked the right questions when she wandered back there. He said people can tell who actually works. It was meant to comfort me. It mostly made me sad. Then came the family fallout, which was somehow even worse than the business fallout. My phone blew up. Denise wanted my side. My Aunt Carol thought legal action against Lauren would be too extreme between sisters. My cousin Ben, who has never balanced anything but his own IPA on his belly, texted me that family should handle things privately. I asked if he would like to privately repay the $184,000 and never heard back. Mom swung between shame, defensiveness, and denial depending on the day. One afternoon, she called and said Lauren had only been borrowing in a messy way. Borrowing, like the company was a cardigan. Another time she admitted she had believed Lauren when she said I was fading and said, very quietly, "I should have come to you first." That was probably the closest thing to an apology I was going to get. Emma flew in from Chicago 2 weeks later and stayed with me for a long weekend. We ordered Thai food, watched terrible reality TV, and she helped me go through boxes of Dad's old files because I suddenly wanted every scrap of paper that proved I wasn't imagining my own history. At one point, she found an old legal pad with Dad's handwriting on a staffing note. Under my name, he had written "Trusts the numbers." Under Lawrence, he had written "Great" with customers, needs guardrails. Emma held it up and said, "Grandpa clocked her." I laughed so hard I cried, which kind of sums up that month. Lauren and Todd hired their own attorney, naturally. Their strategy at first seemed to be throwing language at the situation until something stuck. They claimed compensation misunderstandings, verbal approvals, business development discretion, unclear authority splits, gendered undermining, all of it. Melissa was unimpressed. Once the related party payments and login trail were organized in one place, the case got a lot less philosophical. We eventually settled part of it rather than drag the company through a full public lawsuit. Lauren agreed to relinquish her operational role, sell back a portion of her ownership at a discounted valuation tied to the findings, and repay a chunk under a structured agreement. I won't pretend that felt satisfying. There is no dollar amount that makes family betrayal feel neatly resolved. It mostly felt like putting sandbags around a flooded basement. The social damage was stranger. For a while, people in our circle acted like we had all attended the same ugly wedding. You'd run into someone at Whole Foods or at a school fundraiser or outside a Blue Jackets game, and they'd do that head tilt before saying, "How are things now?" in a voice that meant, "I heard your sister tried to soft launch your professional funeral and got caught billing spa treatments to the company." A few people were very decent. Kayla sent me flowers with a note that said, "Thank you for always doing the actual work." Harold, of all people, dropped off a tin of Cheryl's cookies at the office during quarter close. Even Melissa, who charges by the hour and smiles like a woman who has seen the worst of humanity in conference rooms, squeezed my shoulder once and said, "You weren't crazy." Do not underestimate what it means to hear that after months of being treated like a fading witness to your own life. As for the business, it recovered. Not overnight and not cleanly, but it did. We cut unnecessary spend, tightened controls, and stopped trying to look like a lifestyle brand for people who call countertop surfaces like they invented them. I hired an actual outside marketing firm with a real contract and measurable deliverables. We updated the website. We modernized things that actually needed modernizing. Turns out you can embrace technology without stealing from your own company or staging a coup against your sister. Funny how that works. Mom still sees Lauren. Of course she does. That's her daughter. She sees me too, but the ease is gone. There's a stiffness now, especially around holidays. Last Thanksgiving, we were all at Mom's house because apparently tradition is more important than comfort. Lauren arrived in a camel coat and acted like she was entering a hostage negotiation. Todd barely looked at me. Chloe, the visiting talent, spent most of dinner staring at her phone. At one point, Lauren asked if the showroom was still doing the Saturday coffee events she had started. I said, "No, but payroll is much cleaner." Emma kicked me under the table. I'm not proud of it. I'm also not sorry. The weirdest part is that if you had asked me 10 years ago which was more dangerous, I would have said me. I'm the blunt one. I'm the one who says the hard thing out loud. Lauren is softer on the surface. She hugs people, she remembers birthdays, she sends links to face serums and linen pants. But some people are only warm when the weather suits them. Under pressure, they don't get colder, they get entitled. A few months ago, I ran into Sandra from bookkeeping at Target. We were both in the detergent aisle because apparently middle age is glamorous that way. She told me she had almost quit last year because Lauren kept pushing her to root things around me. Sandra said she felt guilty for not coming to me sooner. I told her, honestly, she made a lot of people doubt themselves because that was the real trick of it. The money mattered, yes. The lies mattered, yes. But what really got under my skin was how carefully Lauren had built a version of me that people were willing to believe. Tired, outdated, confused, a little embarrassing. Somebody who should be eased aside gently for her own good. It is a very particular kind of violation to have someone narrate your decline while standing on the platform you built. The last direct conversation Lauren and I had was in the parking lot outside our attorney's office after one of the settlement meetings. It was late afternoon, one of those bright, cold days where the sun makes everything look harder than it is. She had oversized sunglasses on, even though it wasn't that sunny. She said, "You always wanted me to be the irresponsible one." I said, "I wanted you to stop making me clean up after you." She took her sunglasses off then and actually looked furious. Not polished furious, not presentation furious, but old familiar furious from when we were kids, and I wouldn't let her borrow a sweater. She said, "Dad never gave me a real chance." I said, "Lauren, Dad gave you a showroom, a title, a salary, and more forgiveness than anybody else in this family. What you wanted was no accountability." She opened her mouth like she was going to say something devastating, then didn't. She just got into her SUV and drove away. That was probably for the best. There are some conversations that can only get uglier. I still think about that meeting sometimes when I'm upstairs in the conference room. Same table, same view down into the showroom, same fake plant in the corner that Kayla keeps threatening to replace because it looks dusty even when it isn't. I'll be reviewing vendor terms or eating a sad desk salad, and for a second I can hear Lauren saying capacity in that careful, pitying voice. Then I remember Harold sliding that folder across the table. I remember the exact look on her face when she realized the story she had been telling about me was about to collide with the story told by bank records, login trails, and her own stupid emails. And honestly, if I live to be 100, I'll still remember that sound. The scrape of paper over polished wood. Quiet, neat, final. Story 3. Done. The story runs 6,698 words, 34,320 characters, which lands around 40 minutes of narration. Every character carries a distinct American name, and nothing is labeled into sections. Here it is, asterisk, I found my daughter packing boxes from my bedroom while I was away. She had an explanation, but it wasn't the one I expected. I came home from Nashville a day early, and that one stupid decision, made because a procurement guy's wife went into labor, is the only reason I still have a house, and the only reason my daughter still looks at me like I am her father instead of like I am a stranger who almost handed her life to somebody else. The job itself was boring. 5 days of industrial safety audits at a parts plant south of Nashville, which is exactly as exciting as it sounds. The client finished everything Friday afternoon, and the plan was to fly home Sunday. But the guy from procurement texted that his wife had gone into labor, and the dinner we had booked died right there. I sat in a hotel room watching the ceiling fan go around for 2 hours, and then I called the airline like a man who just needed to be somewhere else. There was a 6:45 flight on Saturday morning. I took it. I landed at 9:15 with a duffel bag and a headache, stopped for gas and a black coffee, listened to the first 4 innings of a baseball game I did not care about, and pulled into my own driveway at 11:30 in the morning thinking about the lawn. Karen would have made a joke about the lawn. Karen made a joke about everything, right up until she could not anymore. She died 4 years ago, ovarian cancer, 18 months of treatment that I am still not sure helped or just bought us the time to say the things we needed to say. We did hospice at home. She died in the downstairs room that is now my office, in the bed we set up by the window so she could see the garden, and Emily, who was 14, held my hand at the funeral and told me we were going to be okay. We were not okay. We were barely functional for a year. But we got through it, the two of us, the way you get through a flood, by holding on to each other and not looking at the water. 2 years ago, I met Rachel Buckley, and I want to be fair about what happened because I have replayed it 1,000 times. She was a paralegal at a real estate firm, and we got introduced at a retirement dinner neither of us wanted to be at. She was 39, divorced twice, funny in a loud way that filled a room, and she decided she liked me before I had decided anything at all. She laughed at my jokes, she remembered small things I said, she texted me good morning, and after 2 years of coming home to a dark house, that warmth was like standing in front of a fire. It had been so long since anybody chose me. Rachel chose me. That is the part that still hurts, because she chose me the way a person chooses a good parking spot. She has had a key to this house for a year and a half. She stays over 3 nights a week. She has a toothbrush in my bathroom, a robe on my hook, a mug she likes in my cabinet. She has been dropping hints about rings for 6 months, about how this place has good bones, about how we should combine households, about how a man my age should not rattle around alone. And I have been lying to myself about all of it, including about the way Emily went quiet every time Rachel came through the door. Emily is 18. She graduated in June, and she is taking a year off before college because she does not know what she wants to study, and she refuses to spend $40,000 figuring it out, which is Karen's exact argument, word for word, and I hear my wife in my daughter's mouth constantly, and it still stops me cold every time. She works mornings at the coffee shop on Main Street, pays for her own gas, texts me a photo of her dinner when she knows I have been eating cereal. She was polite to Rachel. She was never warm, and I told myself she was being a protective teenager, loyal to a mother who was gone, stubborn in the way that runs in her blood. I told myself she would come around. I told myself a lot of things. The trip was the usual kind of thing. I texted Emily every night, and her replies were short. Fine. Work was fine. Get home safe. And I did not read anything into it, because she is not a big texter. Rachel, by contrast, texted me constantly. Picked up your mail. Watered your plants. Your house misses you. I miss you more. Do not take this the wrong way, but I slept in your bed and it smelled like you and I could not fall asleep. She wrote at midnight on Tuesday, which I have not told a single person because I am embarrassed about how much I liked it. She had keys. It felt like having a life again. So when I heard the noise, I was not thinking about Rachel. I was standing in the kitchen with my bag still on my shoulder, and through the ceiling I could hear a scrape and then a thump, scrape and thump, and then the dry rattle of cardboard against a door frame. I called Emily's name, nothing. I called it again, louder. The scraping stopped for a second, then started again, faster, and my chest went tight in that old way, the way it used to go tight when Karen was sick, and I heard a sound from upstairs that I could not identify, and I dropped the bag on the floor and took the stairs 2 at a time. The bedroom door was open, the light was on, and there were boxes. 3 of them, taped shut, stacked against the far wall, the orange kind you buy in bundles at the hardware store, and each one had a label written in black marker in handwriting I would know anywhere, Emily's handwriting. Dan Office, Dan Keepsakes, Dan Clothes, and Emily was on her knees in front of my closet with the doors thrown wide open and the closet was empty, not reorganized, empty. She had my shirts in a folded pile next to her knee, my dresser drawers pulled out and stacked on the bed, and the lockbox, the little fireproof box I keep under the bed with the important papers and a few things of Karen's, was sitting on the mattress with the lid up. My grandfather's watch was on the nightstand, lying on its side like something put down for the taking. And against the wall was the case for the old shotgun, the one that belonged to Karen's dad, and the case was open, and the gun was not in it. She looked up at me, and her face went through about 6 things in 4 seconds. Surprise, guilt, a fast fake smile that did not reach her eyes. And I stood in the doorway and felt my own face doing the reverse. Dad, she said, you're home early. That is a statement of fact, Emily, I said. Not an answer. She stood up and brushed her hands on her jeans. I was spring cleaning. Sort of. You said the closet was a disaster, and I thought I would organize it before you got back, since you hate coming home to a mess. I looked at the box labeled Dan Office. I looked at the open lockbox. I looked at the empty gun case. The heat was climbing the back of my neck, the way it does right before I say something I regret, and I have spent 2 years making a habit of that. The lockbox, I said. Why is the lockbox open? For dust, she said, and stopped. I was dusting it. You were dusting a lockbox you opened, I said. That is a locked box, Emily. The gun case is open, I said. Where is the gun? She did not answer for 1 second, and that 1 second told me everything. She looked at the door, then at me, then at the boxes, and I watched her start to calculate, and I have known this kid for 18 years. I watched her figure out at 3 years old that a specific kind of crying got her the cookie, and I know every tell she has. The calculation happening on her face right then was the biggest tell of her life. Emily, where is the gun? Grandpa's gun, she said. I put it somewhere safe. Somewhere safe, I said. Safe from what? She did not answer. She picked up my grandfather's watch and held it out to me with both hands, like she was giving back something she had borrowed, and her hands were shaking. I was not stealing, Dad, she said, and her voice cracked right down the middle. I swear to you, I was not stealing from you. I would never do that. I need you to believe that one thing. Then tell me what you were doing, I said. 3 boxes, taped, labeled, my locked up stuff, my gun, and you have not given me one single sentence that makes sense. I cannot, she whispered. Not yet. You're going to be so mad. I am already mad, Emily. No, she said, and she shook her head so hard her hair swung. You don't get it. You're going to be mad at her, and you're going to hate me for being the one who told you. Her, I said. Her who? She would not answer. She started crying instead, the big, ugly kind she has not done in front of me since she was 12 and her hamster died, and she slid down the wall and sat on the floor between my closet and my bed with her hands over her face, and I knelt down in front of her, and for a second I forgot I was angry, because she is still the kid who holds my hand crossing a parking lot even though she is grown, and watching her break like that did something to me I cannot put into words. Emily, I said, softer than I meant to. Just talk to me. Whatever it is, we handle it together. You know that. You have always known that. She wiped her face on both sleeves and looked at me, and what I saw in her eyes was not guilt anymore. It was fear. The real kind, the kind you cannot fake, the kind you only see in somebody who has been carrying something heavy alone for days. Dad, she said, it was never about me. Okay, it's about Rachel. I sat down on the floor across from her, right there in the middle of my bedroom that had been turned inside out, and I waited. She took a breath you could hear from across the room, the kind of breath you take before jumping off something high, and then she started at the beginning. Wednesday, noon. I was in Nashville in a conference room full of safety binders, and Emily was home making lunch for herself. Rachel had texted her that morning, asking if she could stop by to grab my mail and water the plants, which was not unusual because Rachel had keys, and Rachel liked to insert herself into everything, and Emily had learned to just say fine. Rachel showed up with a man. Emily heard the front door, heard two voices, heard them go past the kitchen, heard the office door slide shut. The office is the room with the pocket door, the one that never closes all the way, and there is always a gap wide as two fingers left at the edge. Emily did not think anything of it at first. She was making a sandwich. Then she heard Rachel laugh, that loud actress laugh she does, and then she heard a man say something she did not catch, and then she heard Rachel say, "His signature is right here on this page." Emily ate her sandwich standing at the counter, and then she got curious, and then she got brave, and she walked down the hall on her toes the way she used to when she was trying to sneak up on me, and she knelt down next to the office door and looked through the gap. Rachel was standing at my desk with her phone in her hand, held flat over a spread of papers, taking pictures. The man was behind her, leaning over her shoulder. He was stocky, in a polo shirt, and Emily did not know his name then, but she would learn it. She heard the man say, "You sure he won't notice?" And she heard Rachel say, "He does what I tell him." She heard Rachel say he would sign anything I put in front of him. That is the whole point of me. And then Rachel laughed her actress laugh again, and the man said, "Once the deed's in her name, this place is money in the bank." And Rachel said, "Not yet. Don't count it before we record it." Emily said she sat there on the floor in the hallway for a full minute, not breathing. Then she heard Rachel say, "Let's get lunch. I'm starving." And she scrambled back to the kitchen with her heart going like a rabbit. And she was standing at the counter with the sandwich half in her mouth when Rachel came out of the office and smiled at her like nothing had happened at all. "Don't mind us, sweetie," Rachel said. "Your dad asked me to handle some paperwork while he's gone. Nothing to worry about." And the man looked at Emily for a second too long, and then they left. Emily did not tell me any of this on the phone that night because she did not want to say it to a voicemail or a hotel room. She wanted to wait until I was home, and she also wanted proof, because she knew exactly how it would sound. She knew I would say she was imagining things, that she was jealous, that Rachel would never. So she waited. And on Thursday evening, she got a text from Rachel that said, "I'll be by tomorrow to water the plants. Maybe plan to be out, okay?" And Emily looked at that text, and something in her decided she was done waiting. She went into the office after dark. She said her hands were shaking so bad she could hardly get the door open. She checked the printer first, and the tray was empty, and she almost left, and then she looked on the floor next to the printer, and there it was, one single page that must have slid off the stack, face down, white official. She turned it over. It was a quitclaim deed, grantor Daniel R. Whitfield, grantee Rachel Marie Buckley. Property, our house, our address, our parcel number, the whole thing spelled out in legal language that made Emily's eyes hurt. Dated the 12th of the month. And in the signature block, my name, in handwriting that was so close to mine that Emily said she stared at it for a minute, wondering if I had actually signed something. Before she remembered, I had been in Nashville since Monday and had not touched a pen in this house all week. There was a notary block at the bottom with a stamp and a name she could not read, some cursive, initials B and S, and above it a signature that was not mine. Emily took a picture of the deed with her phone. Then she took a picture of the printer, the floor, the office, everything. Then she folded the page itself into fourths and put it in her hoodie pocket, because she said she did not trust a picture to be enough, because she said pictures could get deleted and a paper could not if she kept it on her body. Then she called Uncle Paul. Paul is my older brother. He is an accountant in Columbus, Ohio, and he is the person in this family who stays calm when everybody else is on fire. And Emily said she just started crying into the phone before she even got a single sentence out. Paul let her cry for a minute, and then he said, "Okay, honey, start at the beginning," and she did. When she finished, Paul was quiet for a long time, and then he said 3 things. "Do not tell Rachel you know. Copy everything you can. And get your father's important things out of that house tonight, because if that deed is what I think it is, that woman now believes she owns that house, and people who believe they own a house tend to feel entitled to everything in it. Emily asked, "What about the gun?" And Paul said, "Especially the gun." So Friday, when Rachel came by to water the plants, Emily was there. She had thought about leaving the way Rachel told her to, but she said she could not. She said she wanted to look Rachel in the face and see if there was anything human in there. She made herself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table like she owned the place, which she did, technically, more than Rachel ever would. Rachel came through the door with her watering can and her smile and stopped when she saw Emily sitting there. "I thought we agreed you'd be out today," Rachel said. "I live here," Emily said. "I didn't agree to anything." Rachel set the watering can down on the counter, and Emily said the smile did not leave her face, but something behind it went flat and hard, and she walked over and leaned on the kitchen table with both hands and got right down at Emily's level. "I know you went into the office," Rachel said. "I know you took something. Give it back and we'll pretend this never happened." Emily said. Her voice did the shaky thing, and she hated herself for it. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You are 18 years old," Rachel said, quiet and sweet, like she was explaining something to a child. "You think you're protecting him, but you're a kid, and you don't understand adult business. Your father and I are getting married. I've been telling him for months how hostile you are, how jealous, how you can't stand to see him happy. And I'm going to be his wife, and I'm going to live in this house, and it would be a real shame if your father started to believe his own daughter was the one stealing from him." Emily said she did not say anything because her throat had closed up. Rachel straightened up, picked up her watering can, and headed for the door. At the door, she turned around and said, "Sleep tight, sweetie," and laughed and left. Emily said. She sat at that kitchen table for a long time after the door clicked, and then she got up and started packing. Friday afternoon, she packed the first boxes, my clothes, my papers, Karen's things from the lockbox. She said she worked until her hands were raw and her phone buzzed nonstop because her boyfriend Tyler had been texting her all day asking if she was okay, and finally she told him everything, and he drove over that night and sat on the floor with her while she worked, and he did not ask questions. He just handed her tape and said, "Keep going." Saturday morning, Marge came. Marge is Margaret Lawson, our neighbor across the street, 71 years old, Karen's bridge partner for 20 years, and she has known Emily since the day she was born. Emily called her on Friday night and told her the whole thing. And Marge, who does not mess around, said, "You bring every box over here as fast as you can carry it, and I'll have the garage open. And don't you tell anybody I said this, but I never liked that woman. She smiles with her teeth only." Marge brought her pickup truck, and she and Tyler and Emily loaded the first 3 boxes into the back of it at 8 in the morning, and Emily had just come back upstairs for the 4th load when I walked in the door. That was the whole story. That was what she was doing on her knees in my closet, with my grandfather's watch on the nightstand, and my dead father-in-law's shotgun in the neighbor's garage. She was not stealing from me. She was saving me, box by box, hour by hour, alone for 3 days, while I sat in Tennessee telling the client about ladder safety and texting Rachel that I missed her. I sat there on the floor of my bedroom with the dust from the torn open boxes in the air, and I felt the floor tilt under me. The first thing I said was, "Rachel is not that person." And Emily looked at me with a face I will never forget, not angry, not smug, just sad and tired. And she said she asked you about the mortgage, Dad, at dinner, a few weeks ago. She asked how this place was paid for, and you said paid off, because Mom's life insurance took care of it. And Dad, I watched her light up like a slot machine. I was sitting right there, I watched it happen, and she was right. I remembered it like it had happened yesterday. Rachel across the table at the Italian place, all casual, "How is this place paid for anyway?" And I, proud and dumb, said it's paid for. Karen's insurance took care of the rest. And Rachel leaned forward and said, "That must be such a relief." And her eyes did something I had not recognized then because I had not wanted to. Emily said, "I tried to tell you, Dad. Every time she left her stuff here, every time she asked me what I thought of her, every time I said she's in your house a lot, isn't she? You said she was family. You said I was being a kid. So I stopped trying to tell you," she said. And then, quieter, I thought maybe I was being a kid. I could not look at her for a minute. When I could, I said, "Show me the paper." She reached into the pocket of her hoodie, the big front pocket, and pulled out a page folded into fourths, creased and soft from 2 days of living against her body. She handed it to me, and I unfolded it on my knee, and I read my own name in a stranger's handwriting, Daniel R. Whitfield, and Rachel Marie Buckley underneath it, and our address and the parcel number, and a notary stamp with the cursive initials B and S, and a recorded stamp from the county recorder's office with a date and a time. Thursday, 2:17 in the afternoon. The same afternoon, Rachel texted Emily that she would come by to water the plants. I read it twice. The whole house went quiet. Somewhere downstairs, the refrigerator hummed, and my daughter sat across from me on the floor of my own bedroom, in my own house, that a woman who told me she loved me had recorded into her own name while I was out of town earning money for the both of us, and I understood, finally, with a clarity that made me want to throw up, that Emily had spent 3 days being braver than I had been in 2 years. I still have that page, by the way. I keep it in the lockbox now, folded in fourths with Karen's things. Emily asks me why I don't throw it out. I tell her it's a reminder. She says, a reminder of what? I say a reminder of who packs my bags when I can't see the fire, and then she tells me to stop being dramatic and eat my dinner. I sat on the floor a while longer with that deed in my hands, and then I did what I should have done the moment I found my daughter packing my life into boxes. I hugged her. She went stiff for a second, then she put her face in my shoulder and cried like she had been holding it in for years. And I held her the way I used to hold her when she was small and the world was too big for her. And I said I was sorry, over and over, sorry for yelling, sorry for not listening, sorry for making her carry this alone. She said, "You weren't here, Dad," and that was somehow the worst sentence I have ever heard. Because it was true, I had not been here. I had been in a hotel room in Nashville texting a woman who was stealing my house. While she washed her face in the bathroom, I called Howard Klein. Howard is the lawyer who handled Karen's estate, an old man with a patient voice who has known our family for 30 years, and I told him the whole thing in about 90 seconds, and he listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he said, in this very quiet voice, "Dan, do not laugh at what I am about to say, but this is the best kind of case. Because forgery of a recorded deed is a felony in this state, a Class 2 felony, and the recording makes it worse, not better, because it means the crime is already done, and it left a paper trail you could drive a truck through." He told me to do 5 things. 1. Take a photograph of the deed and of every box and every drawer exactly as they were. 2. Call the police non-emergency line and file a report tonight, not Monday, so there is a timestamp that predates her finding out. 3. Do not confront Rachel alone and do not tell her anything more than the bare minimum. 4. Put the original deed copy somewhere safe that is not this house. 5. Walk my daughter out the door to the neighbors and stay there tonight. Because people who have just been caught doing a felony make bad decisions, and he did not want either of us in the house alone until a judge could look at this. I called the police from the kitchen while Emily stood at the counter drinking water with her hands still shaking, and a dispatcher sent an officer out. Her name was Nicole Grant, and she was young and serious, and she took it more seriously than I could have hoped. She sat at the kitchen table, wrote down everything, photographed the deed, photographed the boxes, took Rachel's name and her address and her license plate from what I knew, and then she looked at me across the table and said, "This is going to sound strange, but you got lucky because she recorded it, and recording it means she committed the crime in writing, and judges like that." She said the county recorder's office can put a fraud alert on the parcel so nothing else moves on it without a court order. She gave me a report number and her card and said, if anything happens, call, and if she comes anywhere near this house, call the actual emergency lines and make sure your daughter is not alone. Emily and I packed a bag. That part was strange, me packing a bag in a house full of boxes of things I had packed, or my daughter had packed for me, and I stood in the middle of the bedroom and laughed once, a dead sort of laugh, and Emily asked what was funny, and I said I feel like a lady in a horror movie who hears a noise and goes to check the basement. She said, "That is not funny, Dad," and I said, "I know," and she almost smiled, and that almost smile was the first real thing that had happened between us in a year. We went across the street to Marge's, And Marge had coffee ready and did not say I told you so, which was the kindest thing she has ever done. And Emily slept on her couch wrapped in a quilt that used to be Karen's. And I sat in Marge's recliner all night watching the dark ship of my own house through the window. And I thought about all the nights Rachel had slept in that bed, and I felt like I had been living with a stranger wearing a familiar face. Rachel called at 8 the next morning, Sunday, bright and breezy. Hey baby, how was the flight? I missed you. Want me to come over tonight? I'll bring that Thai place you like. Just us, she said. Family time. I was standing in Marge's kitchen with Emily listening on speaker, and Emily shook her head hard. No, don't. But I had already made my decision. I said, Rachel, before you come over, answer me one thing. She said, anything, baby. I said, do you love me? She laughed, her actress laugh, and said, of course I love you, Dan. You're my whole world. I said, say it. And she said, I love you, Dan. And I said, then how long were you planning to take my house? It went quiet, the loudest quiet I have ever heard. And then she started talking very fast, the way people do when they are trying to build a wall out of words. What are you talking about? Who told you that? Is this Emily, Dan? She has been lying about me for months. She is jealous. She would do anything to get between us. She has hated me since day one, you know that. I said I have a quitclaim deed with my signature forged on it, Rachel. Recorded Thursday at 2:17 in the afternoon. Notarized by a woman whose name I can't quite read, initials B and S. I have a photograph of you and your brother in my office with my papers spread out on the desk, taken Wednesday while I was in Nashville. And I have a police report with a number on it, filed last night. Another silence. Then she started crying, real crying this time, or at least good crying. And she said it was her brother, it was all her brother, James. He was in trouble, he owed money, he begged her. She never meant for it to go anywhere. She was going to fix it. She was going to make him sign it back. And I said, Rachel, I met James once at a barbecue. He asked me about my roof, and in my entire life, he has never owed me a dime. So let's try that again. And then, piece by piece, she told me the truth because I think she knew the wall was already down. Her brother, James Buckley, is a gambler, and he had borrowed her entire savings for a development deal that turned out to be a gambling debt. And then he disappeared, and she was $60,000 under, credit cards, and a payday loan she could never pay off. And she was losing her apartment. And one night we were at the Italian place, and I smiled at her across the table and told her the house was paid off. And she said something in her, just sat up and started looking at the furniture. She said she was not planning to hurt me. That was the thing. She said it over and over like a prayer. She was not planning to hurt me. She was going to take the house, sell it under market to a buyer James had lined up, pay off everything, and then tell me the truth and give me back the money. And I would forgive her because I loved her, because I had said we were a family. I listened to all of it, and I thought about my daughter on her knees in my closet, and I said you were going to sell my daughter's home out from under us and call it a loan. She said I never meant to go through with it. I was going to fix it, I swear. And I said, you recorded the deed, Rachel. That is going through with it. That is the part where it stopped being an idea and became a crime. She said, don't call it that. I said, I'm not calling it anything. The county recorder called it that. They stamped it. And then I said, the thing I had been saving, and my voice did not even shake. I said, you told your brother I would sign anything you put in front of me. You said that was the whole point of me. You said that in my house, standing in my office, about me, while your brother stood there and laughed. I said, I know you said it because my daughter was in the hallway and she heard every word, and she is the only one of us who was brave enough to do anything about it. Rachel was crying so hard she could barely breathe, and she said I was talking, I didn't mean it, I love you, that part was real. And I said, you meant it enough to record my house in your name, and I don't know what part of that is supposed to be the part I keep. I told her to stay away from the house, to get a lawyer, that Howard Klein would be in touch with her or her attorney on Monday morning, and then I hung up. Emily was standing in Marge's kitchen with her arms wrapped around herself, and she said, I'm sorry, Dad. And I said, for what? And she said, for being the one who told you. And I said, Emily, you are the only reason I still have a roof. Do not apologize to me ever again for that. Rachel showed up at the house at 10 that night anyway. Emily saw the headlights from Marge's window and grabbed my arm with both hands, and I watched her face do that scared thing again, and I said, stay here. Do not come over there no matter what you hear. And I walked across the street in the dark. She was standing on my porch in her nice coat, crying, no makeup, which was the first honest thing I had ever seen on her face, and she said, "Please, let me inside, let me explain, let me fix it. I can fix it." I stood at the bottom of the porch steps and I said, "There is nothing to fix, Rachel. There's only damage to walk back, and you don't get to walk it back in my house." She said, "You're going to ruin my life." I said, "I'm not going to do anything. You did it, you and your brother. You did it to yourselves, and I am just the man holding the police report." She said, "This isn't you. You're not this cold." And I said, "You're right, I'm not. I was never the cold one. I was the one who believed you, and that was the whole problem." She stood there a long time with her hands hanging at her sides, and then she turned around and walked back to her car and drove away. And I stood on my own porch in the dark looking at the front door of my own house, and I could not make myself go inside, so I went back to Marge's and sat in the recliner until the sun came up. Monday morning, Howard Klein filed the emergency motion. Tuesday, the county recorder's office put the fraud alert on the parcel and flagged the deed. Wednesday, the police picked up Bianca Sandoval, the notary whose stamp was on that page, a woman from the title office where Rachel worked, and Howard had been exactly right because Bianca Sandoval did not wait 20 minutes to start talking. She told the detectives everything, that Rachel had paid her $500 cash to notarize a signature she never saw, that Rachel said it was a surprise for her fiancé, that she had done it as a favor and a fee and had been sick about it ever since. They gave her immunity and she sang like a bird. They picked up James Buckley the same week at his girlfriend's apartment in the next county with the sale paperwork for a house he did not own sitting on his kitchen table. The charges came down the way Howard said they would. Forgery of a deed, attempted grand theft, offering a false instrument for recording. Rachel's lawyer worked out a plea, and she stood in front of a judge and pleaded guilty to the forgery count, and the judge gave her 18 months and a lot of math in restitution, and James got his own number next to his name. I did not go to the hearing. Emily asked me if I wanted to, and I said I have nothing to say to her, and Emily said good, because I don't either, and that was the end of that part of our lives. It took 2 weeks for the court to void the deed. Howard explained it to me in his office, leaning back in his chair with his hands folded, and he said the phrase void ab initio, which means invalid from the beginning, and then he said, "In plain English, Dan, she never owned a single brick, and the recorder's office is going to fix the chain of title, and you are going to be fine." And he looked at me over his glasses and said, "Your daughter saved your house. I hope you know that." And I said I know, and I have been knowing it since the moment I found her on my bedroom floor. The weekend after the hearing, Emily and I unpacked the boxes. We did it the slow way, me handing her things, her putting them back where they belonged, and we did not talk much, but it was a comfortable silence, the kind we used to have before Rachel, and it felt like coming home to something that had been missing for 2 years. My grandfather's watch was still at Marge's, in the box labeled Dan Keepsakes, and when I opened it, Emily was standing behind me, and she reached into her hoodie pocket and pulled the watch out and held it up, and she said, "I kept this on me the whole time, in case you needed proof I wasn't the one stealing." I took it from her, and I wound it, and I looked at Karen's dad's watch ticking in my hand, and I held it out to her, and I said, "Keep it." She said, "What?" I said, "You earned it, it goes to college with you, and don't argue with me, I'm the dad." She stood there with her mouth open for a second, and then she put it on her wrist where it was too big, and she looked at it and she said, "You are never getting this back." And I said, "I know," and we both laughed, and it was the first time either of us had laughed like that in I don't know how long. She kept it. I let her. Some things are worth more exactly where they are. Story 4. My son told me not to come to his retirement party, so I sent someone in my place, and his first question was about me. I got the text on a Tuesday morning in early March. My phone was sitting on the kitchen counter next to my cold coffee and a piece of toast I had finished. And I almost missed it because I'd gotten used to my son not texting anymore. The text was from Chris, 49 years old, senior partner in a litigation firm in Chicago. I never could keep the name of straight. Hayes, Morrow, and Atchison, he told me 4 times. And the text said, "Dad, I'm having a retirement dinner in May at the Drake. Black tie. I'll send the formal invite. Tell Marie I love her. I want to keep the dinner small. We'll talk soon." I put the phone down. He said, "Tell Marie I love her." That was new. In 9 months, he'd said maybe 4 words to her over the phone, and they'd all been neutral verbs. I picked the phone up again. I read the text a second time. I read it a third. He said, "Tell Marie I love her," which is how you write a thing when you don't quite feel it yet, like practicing the words out loud before you say them to the person. He wanted me to be his mouth. He just wasn't ready to open his yet. Either way, I had a text from my son. I had a dinner invitation in May. I did what any retired 70-year-old does in Scottsdale when his son invites him somewhere. I told Marie, and she screamed. We hadn't been to a black tie event since Jenny's rehearsal dinner in 2017. We hadn't been to Chicago since the trip my first wife Linda and I had taken in the spring of 19, 3 weeks before the diagnosis. We hadn't been to a small dinner with my son since Christmas 2018, when he came in for 2 nights and stayed at a hotel and was cordial to Marie the way you are cordial to a coworker at the office party. He called her Marie with a period at the end. He had called me Dad with a period at the end for almost 5 years, so this was something. Even with the period. Linda Brennan died 5 years ago this August. Pancreatic. 9 weeks from diagnosis to the last breath, and I still don't know how I made it through that 9 weeks. I met her when I was 22. She was a junior at ASU. She had a Polaroid camera, a yellow Renault, and a way of sitting in a chair that made you feel like the chair was meant for her. I proposed in 4 months. She accepted in 5. We were married in 76. We had Chris in 77. We had Jenny in 79. We bought the house on East 2nd Street in Mesa. We ran the auto dealership. We did the cul-de-sac with the Myers and the Pattons. We coached the Little League. We went to Easter at St. Timothy's because Linda believed in it even when I didn't. We did all of it for 43 years, and then she was gone. I met Marie in 2021 at a Memorial Day cookout at a friend's house in Tempe. She was a retired 3rd-grade teacher. She had 3 grandchildren. She didn't try to replace Linda. She didn't pretend to understand. She just said, "Tom, can I take you for a cup of coffee?" And I said, "Yes, you can." We got married at the courthouse in 22. Jenny came. Chris didn't. He sent a letter, not a text, a real letter on cream paper in his careful lawyer's hand that said, "Dad, I'm not ready for this. I'm glad you have someone. I'm glad you're not alone. I'm just not ready to stand next to you and pretend it's okay yet. I do love you. I hope you can understand. Chris." I read it at the kitchen island and I sat there a long time. I called Greg. Greg Whitfield has been my best friend since '83. He was at Linda's bedside every night I wasn't. He was at my first wedding. He was the godfather to both my kids. He was the one Jenny called when Chris didn't answer the phone the night of the funeral. Greg is married to Karen. He retired from being an exploration geologist in 2010. He has a flats boat on Watson Lake and a beagle named Otto who eats everyone's leftovers. He called me, Greg said on the phone. He cried for 40 minutes. He said he can't forgive you yet. He said he doesn't know why. He said to tell you he's sorry he isn't bigger than he is. Now this past March, the text, the dinner, the Drake, black tie, formal invite to follow. The formal invite arrived a week later, cream envelope, hardstock, card with gold bevel, Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Brennan, you are cordially invited to celebrate the retirement of Christopher Brennan from the partnership of Hayes Morrow and Atchison. I read it twice. There it was. Marie's name, my name. Black tie. The Gold Coast room at the Drake Hotel. I put it on the refrigerator with the Arizona magnet under it. I waited. 2 days later, an email. Not a text. An email from an account I didn't know my son had, chris.brennan.law@gmail.com. The subject line said, May 14. The body said, Dad, I want to keep this dinner small. Firm partners, my closest friends, Jenny and her husband, Marie. I think it'd be better if you attended with Greg if Greg is willing. I've already asked Greg, so please don't be offended. I just want to do this right. Chris. He had reached for Greg again. He had reached for the version of me he could tolerate. He had uninvited Marie in writing from an account he thought I wouldn't check 4 days before I'd booked the flight. I put the laptop down. I walked into the kitchen. Marie was at the island with her reading glasses on, doing a crossword. Who's that from, On? Chris? He writes. That's new. She looked over. She could read my face from across the room. What is it? He wants to keep the dinner small. He'd like Greg to come instead of you. She put her pen down. Tom, I understand. I really do. Marie, no, sit down. I understand. He's your son. He lost his mother. He's not done with that. Maybe he never will be. We don't have to fix him. She picked the pen up. She finished the next clue. I stood there. I was angry, and I didn't know who I was angry at. I thought about Jenny saying, we all have to do better, Dad. I thought about Greg saying, I want you to do what's right for your son. I thought about my own father, dead 15 years now, saying once in a rare lucid moment, Tommy, you cannot control how people love you. You can only control how you love them back. Marie, I said. Yeah? I don't want to go. I want you to not go. I don't want to share him with Marie and the people she's not and the 5 years we haven't been back to his city. I don't want to be the compromise he keeps trying to make. She set the pen down. What are you saying? I'm saying I'm not going. I'm saying Greg goes in my place. I'm saying Chris doesn't get me as the smaller version of me with the only bring Greg rider. I'm saying if I am not invited as Tom, then I am not coming at all. She stared at me for a long time. Tom, yeah, are you sure? Yes, I'm sure. If I go and Greg goes, I'm not really there. I'm there as some kind of smaller thing. We are the family we are. All of us. Or we are not, and we stay home. That's either the most generous thing or the most stubborn thing you have ever said to me. I think it's both. She came around the island. She put her arms around my neck. Okay, she said. Okay, you stay. I'll stay. We will cook a small dinner in our own kitchen. We will watch the Diamondbacks. We will let your son have Chicago. And you will write your son a letter. A real one, and you will give it to Greg to put into his hand at that dinner. You will write it tonight. I don't know what to say. You'll know. I called Greg. Greg? Tom, are you still going to Chicago? Yes. He called me on a Sunday. He said if Greg and Tom go, he can do it. He just can't have her there yet. He doesn't know why. He might never know why. Well, here's the new plan. Here's how it is now. I'm not going. You're not bringing me. You're bringing him a letter from me, sealed, that I will put in a manila envelope tonight. You're going to walk into that Gold Coast room, and the first thing my son is going to ask you is going to be about me. And you're going to tell him the truth, that I stayed home, that I love him, that I sent you in my place, because if I had gone, I would have been the half version of Tom Brennan, and I am not a half version anymore. I've been a half version for 5 years, and I'm done being one. That's what the letter is going to say. A long pause. Tom, yeah? That's the most insane thing you have ever said to me. I'm in. What time is my flight? Whatever time you want, Greg. I'll fly out the morning of the 14th. Thank you, buddy. Thank Linda. She would have told you to do this. I sat down at the desk in the den. I took out a piece of the stationery Linda used to write her thank you notes on. Cream paper, raised initial at the top. I had 3 sheets of it in the top drawer for sentimental reasons. I uncapped a pen. I sat for a long time. I wrote a letter. I'll tell you what I wrote, because it's the kind of letter my wife would have written if my wife had been the one home and not me. Chris, I am writing this at the desk in the den on a Wednesday afternoon in early May. The window is open. A hummingbird keeps coming back to the feeder Marie hung last summer. Marie is in the kitchen making a meatloaf for the 2 of us because she's decided we should have something home-cooked on the night of your dinner. I am not coming to Chicago. I know you asked me to come, and I know you asked me to come with Greg and not with Marie. I am declining both. I am not coming because I have spent 5 years being half of the father I should have been. When your mother died, I made a list of things I would do differently. I made the list in the hospital waiting room at Honor Health on a paper cup. The list had 4 items. I have done exactly none of them. I have run the dealership another 2 years past when I should have stopped. I have not taken the trip to Portugal. I have not called you on the days I should have called you. I have not learned how to love Marie out loud in front of you without making it sound like a betrayal of your mother. You are right to feel what you feel. I am not going to fix it. I am only going to try not to make it worse. The reason I am not coming is that you do not want me there. You want Greg there. You want the version of Tom Brennan that has been a buffer for 30 years, the version that knows how to sit at a dinner table and make the kind of small talk that lets you not bring up the things you do not want to bring up. I have taken that role 100 times in my life, and I will take it again for you when you ask. But this is not that night. This is your retirement. You are 49 years old. You have spent almost 3 decades doing the work you chose to do. You have made a career your mother would have been proud of because she read more of the paper than either of us. You have a wife, Donna, who has stood with you through the years I have not. You have a sister, Jenny, who has held the family together when I could not. You have 2 small nibblings who don't yet understand why Grandpa lives so far away and who I want to understand less of that every year. I am proud of you. I have been proud of you since the day you were born, and I have not said it enough. I have a favor. Read this letter before you speak tonight. The cufflinks Greg is wearing were made by Karen from an L charm of your mother's that I kept in a felt box in the closet because I couldn't throw it away. I love you. I am sorry it has taken 5 years to start saying so out loud. If you want to talk, my phone is on. If you don't want to talk tonight, my phone is still on tomorrow. Dad, I folded the letter. I put it in a stamped envelope. I put it in a manila envelope. I brought it into the kitchen for Greg when he came over on some Saturday to pick up his suit from the cleaners I'd run for him. Greg flew out the morning of the 14th from Prescott on a 6 a.m. Air Boeing. He landed at O'Hare at 9. He carried the manila envelope inside his jacket. He had on a charcoal suit with a yellow tie. He had on the cufflinks Karen had made for my wife's L charm. He had on the wristwatch I'd bought him in 91. He rented a car and drove to the Drake. I sat on the porch in Scottsdale with Marie. We did the crossword together. Marie was better at the bottom of the puzzle. I was better at the top. We had only been doing it together, just the two of us, for 9 months, and we were about even on the record. At 4 o'clock Phoenix time, Greg texted, "I'm in. I have your envelope. I'm going to the lobby on the 3rd floor at 5:30. I wrote back, "Okay, tell him I love him. Tell him I'm not angry." He wrote back, "He might not believe you." I wrote back, "I don't need him to believe me tonight. I just need him to hear it." Marie shouted from the kitchen, "Tom, what's the 11 across?" Allegiance. I had loyalty. Both work. At 5:45 my time, my phone rang. It was Greg. "Greg? He's here. He's in the lobby. He's alone. He came down early. He saw me. He's shaking, Tom. His hands are shaking." He hugged me for about 30 seconds and I didn't let go. "Did you give him the letter?" He opened it. He read the first line. He handed it back to me and he said, "Uncle Greg, read it to me. I don't trust my own hands right now. What did you do?" I read the whole thing to him, Tom. I read it word for word. He stood at the railings of the lobby and he listened. Donna came down the elevator. She saw him. She didn't say anything. She took his hand. She held it while I read. When I got to the second paragraph, he cried. When I got to, "I am proud of you," he put his forehead against the marble. I was standing in the kitchen. Marie was behind me, holding a wooden spoon. Read it all, word for word. He took the letter back. He read it again. He folded it and put it in his inside pocket. He said, "Uncle Greg, my father. Is he all right? Did I hurt him? I need to know that he's all right. Tell me the truth." I sat down at the island. "What did you tell him?" I told him you're better than you've ever been. I told him you are the strongest you have ever been. I told him the truth. He asked, "The first thing about you, Tom. Not the dinner, not Marie, not the firm. About you, Greg. I know. Are you crying?" "I'm not crying. I'm cutting onions. There are no onions here. Yes, I'm crying. I'll call you later." He hung up. Marie came and stood behind me. She put her hands on my shoulders. "What?" He asked about me. The first thing. He asked if his father was all right. Of course he did, Tom. Of course he did. I sat with that for a long time. Marie went back to the kitchen. I heard her cracking eggs. I heard her humming something old. I didn't get up. I watched the light move across the granite. At 7:45 Phoenix time, the dinner started. There was a string quartet. There were about 70 people in tuxedos and gowns. There were round tables with white linens and arrangements of calla lilies. There was a lectern at the front of the room. There was a small stage. There was my son in a tuxedo with new glasses I had never seen, standing up to give the speech of his life, raising a glass. I wasn't there. I was at my own kitchen table with my own wife, eating meatloaf and watching the Diamondbacks fall behind the Dodgers. At 8:30 my time, Chris texted. The text said, "Dad, I'm about to speak. The cufflinks are on the table. Donna has a copy of Mom's obituary in her clutch. She didn't tell me. Greg told me at the table. Uncle Greg has been crying into his dessert for the last 4 minutes. I'm about to say things about you." "Don't be mad," I wrote back. "I'm not mad. Say it." At 9:15 my time, my phone rang. It was Greg. He was in his tux. He was a little drunk. He was talking fast. "Tom, Greg, he talked about you." "What did he say?" "He said my father could not be here tonight. He sent my Uncle Greg." He sent Greg with a letter he wrote for the occasion, and with cufflinks Karen made for my mother's necklace, and with 2 instructions. The first was that he wanted me to know he was proud of me. The second was that he wanted me to know he loves his wife, Marie, and that he asks for my blessing. He paused. He said every word, Tom. He said, "I give my blessing to my stepmother. I ask her forgiveness for the time it took. I love her. She loves my father. That is enough." Greg, did he really say that? He said every word of it. He cried when he said it. Donna cried when he said it. The room got quiet, and Donna's father stood up and raised his glass. What happened then? He went around the room and he hugged the partners. He hugged Donna's parents. He hugged Jenny and Mark. He came to our table and he put his arms around me and he said, "Uncle Greg, my father is the kindest man I have ever known. He's patient. He's got infinite patience. He's the kind of patient that only becomes patient after you have lost a lot. Tell my father I love him. Tell him to call me tomorrow at 8 my time. Tell him Donna and I want to come to Arizona in July." I sat with the phone to my ear for a while. I couldn't speak. "Tom, give me a second." Marie was standing in the doorway. She had her hand over her mouth. Greg, tell him I'll be on at 8. Tell him we're going to cook steaks. Tell him Donna should bring a swimsuit. The pool isn't heated, but it's July. I'll tell him. Thank you, Greg. Thank Linda, Tom. She did this. From somewhere she did this. I hung up. I put the phone down on the kitchen counter. I sat down at the island. Marie brought me a piece of lasagna she had made at some point in the evening without my noticing. She put it in front of me. She put a fork in my hand. You didn't eat, she said. No. Eat. I ate. I looked at the photo wall. There was a wedding photo of Linda and me from '76 in a frame I carried across 3 houses. There was a school picture of Chris at 8 with the bowl cut he hated. There was a school picture of Jenny at 12 with her crooked smile. There was a photo of me and Greg on the flats boat in 2014, sunburned and laughing. There was a photo of Linda and me at the airport in Lisbon in 3 weeks before the diagnosis, holding coffees and looking at a departures board and not knowing what we'd just walked into. There was a photo of Marie and me at the courthouse in 22, both of us in something plain, smiling the way 2 older people smile when they're not sure yet, but they're hoping. On the wall, they were all of them. They all belonged. They had always all belonged. My phone buzzed. It was Chris. A photo. A photo of the cufflinks on the tablecloth in front of his place setting, slightly out of focus, the gold catching the chandelier light. The caption, "She's with us. Thank you, Dad." I picked up my fork, the Diamondbacks lost, the lasagna was good, the kitchen window was open. The hummingbird came back to the feeder one more time and hovered at the glass, watching us from the other side of it. Marie made a small sound at the back of her throat that I didn't hear. I was looking at the photo wall. I was sitting in the kind of silence that is not empty. Story 5. My daughter said her husband had nothing to do with my estate. Then I heard him mention a number he shouldn't have known. My name is Frank Delaney, and I am 71 years old, which means I have lived long enough to know that most people are exactly who they show you on the inside. It just takes a while for the outside to catch up. My wife Ruth passed away 3 years ago this spring, and I still reach for her hand in the morning before I remember she is not there, and I still set out 2 coffee cups before I catch myself and put one away. We were married for 44 years, and we built everything together, a small construction company that started with 1 pickup truck and a handshake and ended with a business we sold for more money than either of us ever imagined having. Ruth kept the books, and I kept the crews honest, and when we sold the company to a regional developer in 2018, we walked away with more than $2 million, and we felt like the luckiest people in the county. We had 3 children, Andrew, who is the oldest and an engineer with a steady hand and a steadier temper, Megan, who is our middle child and the one most like Ruth, and Hannah, who is the baby and a nurse who has seen more of the world's pain than I have ever seen. They are all good people, and I do not say that the way fathers say it. I say it the way a man who has watched them grow says it, with evidence. Andrew married a school teacher named Julia, and they gave us a grandson, Tyler, who is 11 and already smarter than his grandfather. Hannah is engaged to a firefighter and spends her days off at my house fixing things I did not know were broken. And Megan was the one who held my hand at Ruth's funeral and told me she would take care of me. And I believed her, because I believed everything Megan ever said. The money from the sale sat in investments for a while, and Ruth and I talked about it often, about what we would leave behind. And Ruth said she wanted the children to have what we never did, a start, a cushion, a chance to say no to a bad job or a bad marriage without being trapped. She said that last part with a particular look in her eye, and I knew she was thinking about the first 10 years of our marriage, when we were young and broke and every mistake cost us something we could not afford. After Ruth died, I did not touch the money for almost a year. I could not bear to look at the statements because every number on every page was a number she had helped earn. And then one day I woke up and I understood that the money needed a plan, because a man in his late 60s with a widow's heart and a full bank account is a target, whether he admits it or not. I hired an estate attorney named Margaret Caldwell, Maggie, to everyone who has ever worked with her, and she is the sharpest woman I have ever met, which is saying something because Ruth was no fool. Maggie came to the house on a Tuesday afternoon with a leather portfolio and a list of questions, and we sat at the kitchen table where Ruth used to do the books, and we went through everything. The house, the investments, the savings, the insurance, all of it. And when it was all added up, the total came to $2.4 million after the taxes and the fees and the funeral costs were accounted for. Maggie wrote the number on a piece of paper and showed it to me, and then she tore the paper into small pieces, and put the pieces in her purse, because that is the kind of lawyer she is. And she said, Frank, this number stays between you and me and no one else, not your children, not your pastor, not your best friend. And I agreed because I did not want my children to treat me like a walking inheritance. I wanted them to treat me like their father. The trust was set up that winter, and Maggie explained it to me in plain language, which I appreciated because I have sat through enough contractor meetings to know that people who use big words are usually hiding small intentions. The house would go to the 3 children equally when I passed, the investments would be split 3 ways, and there was a provision that if any of my children were ever in a position where creditors or lawsuits or bad marriages threatened their share, that share could be protected by a trustee who made decisions in their best interest. I asked Maggie if that last part was necessary, and she said, Frank, you have 3 children, and 2 of them are unmarried, and people change, and circumstances change, and I would rather build this fence now than fix this fence later. I signed the documents in her office on a Thursday, and she shook my hand and said, Congratulations, you have done the hardest and the most loving thing a parent can do. And I drove home feeling like I had just done something responsible, which is a feeling I now know I should have been suspicious of. That was 2 years ago, before Derek. Megan met Derek Whitfield at a wedding in the city, the wedding of a college roommate, and she came home the next weekend with that look, the one Ruth had when she first met me, and I knew immediately that something had changed in my daughter's life. Derek was a salesman. He sold commercial real estate, or he said he did, and he had a way of talking that made rooms feel warmer and wallets feel lighter, and I do not say that with affection. He was handsome in a polished way, with a haircut that cost more than my first car and a laugh that he aimed at people like a spotlight, and the first time I met him, he shook my hand with both of his and called me sir, and I have never trusted a man who calls me sir before we have even shared a meal. Megan brought him to Sunday dinner at my house, and Andrew and Julia were there with Tyler, and Hannah came with her fiancé, and I watched Derek work the table like a contractor working a room of potential buyers. He talked about his father, who had built a chain of hardware stores in Ohio, and his mother, who had been a judge, and his own plans to open an investment firm that would let him help families like ours. And he said ours with a warmth that should have made me feel included, but instead made me feel measured. Andrew asked him polite questions about the market, and Derek answered them with confidence and no real information, the way men do when they have rehearsed their expertise. Hannah asked him where he grew up, and he said Cincinnati. And when she pressed him on which high school, he laughed and said the one that let him in, and I filed that in the back of my mind the way I filed every small slip. Because a man who cannot answer a simple question about his own past is a man who has decided his past is a liability. Megan married him 8 months later in a small ceremony at a vineyard, and I walked her down the aisle with a smile I had to practice in the mirror for a week beforehand. Ruth would have known what to say to me. Ruth would have told me to trust my daughter and give the boy a chance and let love do its work. And I wanted to believe that. I genuinely wanted to believe that, because I am not a man who enjoys being right about other people's failures. So I smiled and I danced and I made a toast about new beginnings, and I gave the happy couple a check that was generous and reasonable, and I told myself that my instincts were just the reflexes of an old man who had been burned once or twice, and that Derek would prove me wrong, because people deserve the chance to prove you wrong. For a while it seemed like he might. Derek got a job at a mid-sized brokerage in the city, Megan told me, and they moved into a nice apartment with a view of the river, and they came to my house every other Sunday like clockwork, and Derek helped me carry the groceries and fix the latch on my gate and asked me questions about my business with what looked like genuine interest. I told him about the early days, about the winter we poured foundations in the snow, about the client who paid us in cattle, and he listened and laughed at the right moments and remembered details from one visit to the next, which impressed me more than anything else, because a man who remembers your stories is a man who is paying attention. I told myself that was what he was doing, paying attention the way a good son-in-law pays attention, and I let myself relax a little, because being suspicious of your daughter's husband is exhausting work, and I was an old man who wanted peace. The first crack appeared 6 months after the wedding at a family dinner for Tyler's birthday. Derek arrived late, which was normal, and he was flushed in a way that had nothing to do with the weather, and he apologized with a story about a client who had pulled a deal at the last minute, and I noticed that Megan kept her hand on his arm the whole night, the way you steady someone who might tip. After dinner, I was in the kitchen loading the dishwasher when I heard Derek on the phone in the backyard, and the window was open and his voice carried, and I am not proud of listening, but I am also not a fool, and I heard him say, "I told you it was handled," and then a pause, and then he said, "The client," his voice low. "The client is a cash cow. We just have to keep milking it until the old man dies." And I felt the temperature in my chest drop by 10 degrees. I stood very still with a plate in my hand, and I heard Megan call him from inside, and I heard him laugh and say, "Coming, babe." And I put the plate in the dishwasher and I wiped my hands on a towel and I told myself I had misheard, that he was talking about an actual client, an actual cow, a metaphor that made sense in the world of sales. But I did not forget it, because I have spent my life around men who talk about money, and I know the difference between a man discussing a deal and a man discussing a death. I started paying closer attention, the way you do when you are no longer allowed the luxury of not paying attention. I noticed that Derek's job changed often, that he was at a different firm every few months, that the stories about his father's hardware stores shifted depending on the audience, that he had a phone he kept face down and a set of golf clubs he never used. I noticed that Megan had started asking me careful questions about my health, about my blood pressure, about whether I had updated my will, and she asked them sweetly and lightly, the way a loving daughter would, but I had raised her and I knew her, and there was a rhythm to those questions that felt practiced. I told myself I was being paranoid, and then I told myself that paranoia is just intuition with a badge on, and then I told myself I would wait, because a man with an inheritance and a daughter he loves does not make accusations without evidence. He gathers evidence the way he gathers wood for a winter fire, slowly and steadily and without announcing it. The night everything changed was a Sunday in early autumn, and the leaves were turning and the air smelled like apples, and I had made my spaghetti sauce, which is the one dish Ruth taught me that I do not ruin. Andrew and Julia came with Tyler, and Hannah came alone because her fiancé was on shift, and Derek came without Megan because Megan had a migraine, he said, and she was resting at home. I found that strange because Megan never missed Sunday dinner, and I found it stranger that Derek was here without her, dressed like he was going to a meeting instead of a family kitchen, his tie loosened but still on. He ate 2 plates of spaghetti and complimented the sauce, and asked Andrew detailed questions about a bridge project Andrew had mentioned once in passing, and he was charming and engaged and present in a way that made the hair on my arm stand up, because no one is that present unless they want something that is not on the table. After dinner, I went out to the garage to get a box of light bulbs for Hannah, and the garage door was open and the evening air was cool, and I heard Derek's voice from around the corner of the house on the side porch where the old rocking chair sits. He was on the phone again, and this time there was no window between us, just the corner of the house and a hedge that was thicker than he thought, and his voice was clear as a bell, and I heard him say, "It is what I told you." 2.4. The old man keeps everything in trust with Margaret Caldwell. I saw the paperwork myself, and once he is gone, it splits 3 ways, and that is 800 grand a piece minimum, plus the house. There was a pause, and then he laughed, that spotlight laugh, and he said, "No, Megan does not know I know, and she does not need to know, and the less she knows, the safer we are." And then he said, "I have to go," and his footsteps came toward the corner of the house, and I was back inside the garage with a box of light bulbs in my hands before he rounded the hedge, and I will never know how, because my heart was beating so loud I could barely hear my own feet. I stood in the garage in the dark with the light bulbs, and I breathed, and I thought 2.4, and I thought Margaret Caldwell, and I thought paperwork myself, and none of those things should have been in Derek Whitfield's mouth, because the number and the lawyer's name had never been spoken in front of him. Not once, not ever. Ruth and I had discussed the estate in front of the children only in the most general terms, and after Ruth died, I had discussed it with Maggie and with the bank, and I had never once mentioned the figure in front of Megan or Derek or anyone else, because Maggie had told me not to, and I had listened. The trust document was in Maggie's office in a locked file cabinet, and the only copy I kept was in a fireproof box in my bedroom closet, behind a false panel that Ruth and I had built together, and no one in my family knew that panel existed, not even Andrew, and I had never shown it to anyone, which meant that Derek Whitfield had either broken into my house, or he had broken into my lawyer's office, or he had gotten to my bank, or he had gotten to my daughter, and every one of those options made me sick in a different way. I stood in the garage for a long time, and then I walked back into the house with the light bulbs, and a smile that I have been practicing for 71 years, and I handed the box to Hannah, and I kissed Tyler on the top of the head, and I said goodnight to everyone, and Derek shook my hand with both of his, and told me the sauce was the best he had ever had. And I looked into his eyes, and I saw nothing behind them, and I said, I am glad you enjoyed it, son, and I meant none of it. Megan called me the next morning to check on me, which she did every Monday. And I asked her how her head was, and she said it was better, and that Derek had told her all about the wonderful dinner, and I said he is a wonderful storyteller. And she laughed and said that is what I love about him, and I felt my stomach turn over. I asked her, lightly, the way I had learned to ask, whether she and Derek talked much about money, and she said, of course. We have a budget, Dad. We are adults, and I said, of course you are. And I asked whether Derek ever asked about my finances, and there was a pause on the line, just a beat, and she said he asks how you are doing, Dad, not how your portfolio is doing. And I said, good, that is good. And I hung up and I sat in my kitchen and I looked at the wall for a long time. I called Maggie that afternoon and I did not tell her what I had heard because I wanted to know what she knew before I told her what I knew. I asked her whether anyone other than the two of us had seen the trust documents, whether there had been any requests, any copies, any access logs. And she said, Frank, the documents are in a locked file, and I am the only one with the key, and nothing has been requested by anyone. And then she said, why are you asking? And I said, no reason, just doing an old man's due diligence. And she said, due diligence is what people say when they are worried about something. And I said, I am not worried, Maggie, I am just thorough. I drove to the bank the next day, and I sat down with Curtis Bell, who has managed my accounts for 15 years, and who knew Ruth and who cried at her funeral, and I asked him whether anyone had called or visited about my accounts, whether there had been any unusual activity, any document requests, any new authorized users, and Curtis looked at me over his glasses and said, Frank, is something wrong? And I said, I do not know yet. And he said, let me check. And he checked, and he found nothing, no calls, no requests, no new names on anything, and he said the account is clean as a whistle, and he said it slowly, like a man who wanted me to hear the part under the words. I thanked him, and I drove home, and I sat in my truck in the driveway, and I thought about the false panel in my closet, and I thought about the last time anyone had been in my bedroom, and I realized with a cold feeling that I had no idea, because I do not lock my bedroom when family visits, because I never thought I needed to. I went upstairs and I opened the closet and I moved the panel and I took out the fireproof box and the lock was not scratched and the box was exactly where I had left it, and I opened it and the trust summary was there and the deed was there and the life insurance was there, and I counted the pages and everything was there, and I sat on the edge of my bed with the box in my lap and I thought, then how did he see the paperwork? And I could not answer it. I called Leonard Marsh that week. Leonard is a retired detective who lives 2 streets over and who owes me a favor from the time I fixed his roof after the storm, and I asked him to do me a quiet favor, and I told him a name, and I told him I needed to know everything about that name that was public record and everything that was not. Leonard asked me what Derek had done, and I said I did not know yet. That was the problem, that I hoped he had done nothing. And Leonard said, Frank, you do not ask me to dig into a man because you hope he did nothing, and he said he would call me in a week. The week was the longest week of my life, and I have lived through a winter that felt like a war, and the week my grandson was born, and the week Ruth got her diagnosis, and every one of those weeks felt shorter than the 7 days I spent waiting to hear what Leonard Marsh had found about my son-in-law. I went through the motions. I played golf with Paul Becker on Thursday and missed every putt. I went to the grocery store and bought soup I did not eat. I answered Hannah's calls and listened to Andrew talk about his bridge, and I said the right things at the right times. And all the while, my mind kept circling back to the number 2.4 and the name Margaret Caldwell and the question, how? Megan came to dinner the following Sunday, and she came alone because Derek was working, or so she said, and I watched her the way I had watched her since she was a baby, and I saw that she was thinner than she had been at the wedding, and that her smile did not reach her eyes, and that she checked her phone more than she looked at her plate. I asked her if everything was all right in her marriage, and she said, everything was wonderful, Dad. Why would you ask that? And I said, no reason, you just seem tired. And she said she had been busy with work. And I said, of course you have, and I did not push, because I have learned that pushing a child is like pushing a river. It only makes the water angry. Leonard called me on a Thursday night, and I was in the kitchen with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and I answered the phone, and he said, "Frank, I am going to tell you some things, and I want you to sit down." And I sat down. He said Derek Whitfield was born Derek Allen Whitfield in Dayton, Ohio, and his father was not a chain of hardware stores. His father drove a delivery truck for a beverage company until he retired with a bad back and no pension. His mother was not a judge. She worked the register at a department store, and she still does. And Derek told his wife and his friends and his business contacts a version of his life that had as much relationship to the truth as a billboard has to a bedroom. Leonard said Derek had been married before, to a woman named Krista, and there was a son, a boy named Aiden, and the marriage had ended 9 years ago in a divorce that had been described by the judge as contentious. And Derek had been ordered to pay child support, and he had been held in contempt twice for not paying it, and the last address on file for him was a P.O. box in a town where he had never lived. I wrote the names down, Krista, Aiden, and I did not know what to do with them because I had grandchildren of my own, and the idea of a man abandoning a son while he played happy family with my daughter made me want to drive to the city and do something I would regret. Leonard kept going. There was more, there is always more, and I listened with a hand over my mouth. Derek had been involved in a real estate investment company in Cleveland that had gone bankrupt in a way that left a trail of small investors angry and empty-handed, and there had been a lawsuit, and the lawsuit had been settled out of court for an amount that Leonard said he could not confirm, but that he had heard was most of what those investors had. There was a second lawsuit from a former business partner named Bobby Fontaine, who accused Derek of taking money from their shared account. And that one had been dismissed on a technicality, which Leonard said meant the evidence had been there, but the paperwork had not. Derek had filed for bankruptcy 5 years ago and had listed debts of nearly $400,000, and he had listed his occupation as consultant, and the bankruptcy had been discharged, which meant the debts were gone, but the habits were not. I asked Leonard if any of that connected to Margaret Caldwell or to my bank or to anything about me, and Leonard said not that he could find, not yet, but Frank, a man like this does not stop. He only changes zip codes. He asked me what had made me suspicious, and I told him about the phone call, about the number, about the lawyer's name, and Leonard was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "Frank, if you never told him, and your daughter never told him," then he went looking, and a man who goes looking for a woman's inheritance before her father is cold is a man you need to treat like a locked door. I said I did not want to believe it. And he said, "Of course you do not. Nobody wants to believe it. That is why they get away with it." I did not sleep that night, and I did not sleep the next night either. And on Saturday morning, I drove to the city, to the apartment where Megan and Derek lived, and I did not tell them I was coming because I wanted to see the house the way a man sees a house when nobody knows he is looking. Megan was surprised and delighted to see me, and she made coffee, and we sat on their couch, and I looked around the apartment the way a contractor looks at a building, and I saw that the furniture was nice, but rented. I could tell by the way it matched too well and the way the scuffs had been touched up, and I saw that the view of the river was real, but the lease was probably month to month, and I saw a stack of unopened mail on the counter with Derek's name on it and a return address from a collections agency. And I saw that Megan had covered it with a cookbook, which meant she knew or she did not want to know. Derek came home about an hour later, and he was surprised to see me, and his surprise lasted about half a second before the smile came up like a curtain, and he said, "Frank, what a wonderful surprise." And he hugged me, and I let him, because I needed to feel what it felt like to be hugged by a man I was beginning to believe was a predator. We had lunch, and Derek talked about a big deal he was working on, a deal that would change everything, and he looked at Megan when he said the word everything, and she looked at him the way Ruth used to look at me when I promised her the world, with hope and with fear and with love that had no idea what it was in for. I asked Derek about his father, casually, the way you ask about the weather, and he said his father had passed a few years ago, which was a new detail. And I said I was sorry to hear that, and he said it was fine, they were not close, and I said that was a shame, and he said the past is the past, Frank, and I nodded, and I thought, yes, it is, and I know yours. I drove home that evening with the windows down and the radio off, and I thought about what I was going to do, because I had evidence now. Evidence of a kind, not evidence that would stand up in a court of law, but evidence that stood up in the court of a father's gut, which is the only court that matters when your daughter is involved. I could confront Derek, but a man who had lied about his entire life would not break under one conversation. He would spin it, he would charm it. He would tell Megan I was a jealous old man with a grudge, and she would believe him because she loved him and because the alternative was too terrible to look at. I could go to Megan with everything Leonard had found, but she would see it as an attack on her marriage and she would defend him because that is what love does before it knows the truth. I could do nothing, and I could watch him work my daughter and my money from the inside, and that was the one option I could not live with. So I did the only thing I could do, which was the oldest trick in the book, and I went to Maggie Caldwell and I told her I had been thinking about simplifying things, and I asked her to draft a short document, a codicil, and she asked me what it said, and I told her, and she looked at me for a long moment, and she said, "Frank, are you sure?" And I said, "I am sure. Maggie, I just want to see something." And she said, "Seeing something is not a legal reason to change an estate plan." And I said, "No, but it is a reason to protect it." And she drafted the document, and I signed it in her office on a Friday afternoon, and I put a copy in the false panel, and I put my plan in motion. The plan was simple, and it was also cruel. And I want to be honest about that, because I do not want to stand here in front of you and pretend I was a saint. I called Megan that evening, and I told her that I had been doing some estate planning, and that I had decided to simplify my affairs, and that I wanted her to know because she was the one who worried about me. And I said, "Megan, the truth is the whole thing is worth less than people think. After all the taxes and the long-term care insurance and the funeral arrangements, it is really more like 1.3 million." And I told her not to tell anyone, especially not her siblings, because they did not need to know the details. And I said, "You know how Andrew gets about money." And she said she understood, and she promised she would not say a word. And I hung up the phone and I put my head in my hands because I had just used my daughter as a test, and I hated myself for it, and I knew I would do it again if I had to. 2 weeks later was Thanksgiving, and I hosted the dinner, and I roasted the turkey the way Ruth taught me, and the house smelled like her, and for a few hours I let myself pretend that everything was the way it used to be. Andrew and Julia came with Tyler, and Hannah came with her fiancé, and Megan and Derek came together, and Derek brought a bottle of wine that cost more than the whole dinner, and he toasted me, and he toasted the family, and he toasted the season, and he was wonderful. And I watched him and I thought about Krista and Aiden and the investors and the $400,000 in debts. And I smiled and I raised my glass and I said to everyone, to the family. After dinner, the men went out to the porch. That is a tradition that has survived, even though I am not sure anyone under 50 knows why. And Derek and Andrew talked about the market, and I stood by the railing and I listened. And then Derek said, in that easy way of his, that he had been doing some thinking about retirement planning, and that he had been reading about trusts, and that he thought the whole estate planning world was a racket, and that if his father-in-law ever needed a second opinion, he knew a guy. I said I appreciated that, and I asked him what he knew about trusts, and he said, "More than most, Frank, more than most." And he told me about a friend of his who had inherited from his parents and had saved a fortune in taxes by structuring things right. And the friend had come into a little over $1 million. And I said a little over $1 million. That is a nice number. And I watched his face, and his face said nothing. And I thought, that is strange, because my daughter was told 1.3, and he rounded down to $1 million. And that is the difference between a man who was told a number and a man who was told a number by someone who misremembered it. I did not sleep that night either, and I walked the house in the dark like a man pacing a cell, and I thought about what I had heard and what I had not heard, and I realized that Derek had not mentioned 1.3. He had not even come close. He had said a little over $1 million, and there was a reason for that, and the reason was that 1.3 was not the number in his head. The number in his head was 2.4, and 2.4 split three ways was 800,000, and 800,000 was a number you saved in taxes on by knowing a guy, and a man who knew the real number would never think the number was 1.3. He would hear 1.3, and he would file it away as a pleasant surprise, and I could see it in the way he had not blinked. I had my answer. I called Maggie on Monday morning and I told her what had happened, and she was quiet. And then she said, "Frank, you need to tell your daughter." And she said, "I am not ready." And she said, "You are never going to be ready." And I said, "I know." And she said, "Do you want me to come with you?" And I said, "No, this one I have to do alone." And she said, "Okay." And then she said, "And Frank, I am drafting the new documents today, the ones we talked about, and I want you to know that what you are doing is not cruel. It is the opposite of cruel. It is the last thing a father can do for a child who is being taken." I said, "Thank you, Maggie." And I hung up and I sat in my kitchen and I looked at the wall and I practiced what I was going to say to my daughter 100 times, and every version of it sounded like an accusation because it was one. I drove to the city on a Wednesday and I did not call ahead, and I found Megan at home alone, and she was surprised to see me on a Wednesday, and she made coffee and we sat at their kitchen counter, and I looked at my daughter and I saw that she was even thinner and that her hands were older than her face, and I said, "Megan, I need to tell you something, and it is the hardest thing I have ever had to tell you, and I need you to hear all of it before you say anything." And I told her everything. I told her about the phone call in the yard and the number and the name of my lawyer, and I told her about the test, and I told her about Derek's father and Derek's mother and the marriage to Krista and the son named Aiden and the contempt orders and the bankruptcies and the investors. And I told her that her husband had never once told her a true thing about his life. And I told her that I had changed my estate plan to protect her share from him. And I told her that I had done it because I loved her. And I told her that I was sorry, that I was so sorry that the evidence was what it was, and that I wished more than anything that I was wrong. And Megan looked at me, and I watched her face go through the stages of a woman learning the shape of her own life, disbelief, and then fear, and then anger. And the anger landed on me because I was the one in front of her, and she said, "Dad, how dare you? How dare you spy on my husband? How dare you test me? How dare you hire a detective to dig through his past like he is a criminal?" And she said, "Derek told me about his family. He told me his father had a business." And I said, "Megan, his father drove a delivery truck." And she said, "Dad, stop." And I said, "I have paperwork." And she said, "I do not care about your paperwork." And she stood up and she said, "You have been looking for a reason to hate him since the day you met him. And you found one. Congratulations. You get to be right, and you get to lose your daughter, and I hope you are happy." I sat on the stool at her kitchen counter, and I let her say all of it. And when she was done, I said, "Megan, I am not asking you to leave him tonight. I am asking you to look at one piece of paper, the divorce record." And I put Leonard's file on the counter, and she pushed it away, and I did not push it back, and I stood up, and I said, "I love you, and I will be here when you are ready." And I walked out of her apartment, and I drove home with tears running down my face, which is something I had not done since the day we buried Ruth. And I thought about how the truth is a terrible thing to carry, and how it is even worse when the person you are carrying it for refuses to take it from your hands. Megan did not call me for 2 weeks, and I did not call her, because I had said everything I had to say, and the rest was up to her. And I knew that if I pushed even once, I would lose her for good. I kept busy the way old men keep busy. I fixed the fence, I cleaned the gutters, I made meals I did not eat, and I waited. And waiting is the hardest work a father can do, harder than pouring concrete in January, harder than anything I ever did with my hands. Hannah called every day, and I could hear in her voice that she knew something was wrong, but she did not ask, because she is my daughter, and she knows that I will talk when I am ready. Andrew came by with Tyler one Saturday, and Tyler asked me why Aunt Megan did not come to Sunday dinner anymore. And I said she is busy, buddy, and he said she is never busy, and I had no answer for a child who was smarter than I was. Then, on a rainy Tuesday night, my phone rang, and it was Megan, and her voice was flat in a way I had never heard it, not even at her mother's funeral. She said, Dad, I want you to come over. And she said, bring the file. And my heart dropped and then it rose because a woman who asks for the file is a woman who has started to look. I drove to the city in the rain and I brought Leonard's file and I also brought the codicil because I knew that a woman who asks for the file will need to see what I had done to protect her, and I did not want her to find out about it from a lawyer's letter after I was gone. Megan opened the door and she looked worse than I had ever seen her. Her eyes were red and her hands were shaking. And she did not say hello. She just stepped aside and let me in, and we sat at the kitchen counter and she said, Dad, tell me again, tell me everything. And I did, slowly this time, and I showed her the divorce record from Dayton with Derek's name and Krista's name and the boy named Aiden. And I showed her the contempt orders and the bankruptcy filing with his signature on it. And I showed her the article about the Cleveland investors, and she read it all. And I watched her read her husband the way a person reads a map of a country they thought they knew. When she finished, she was quiet for a long time, and then she said, he told me his father died, and he told me his mother was a judge, and he told me he had never been married before, and he told me he had no children. And she said, Dad, why did he do it? And I said, because he is a man who wanted what other people built. And she said, I loved him. And I said, I know. And she said, do you think he married me for the money? And I said, I think he married you because you are a door, Megan. And she closed her eyes and then she opened them and she said, I found something while you were driving over. And she went to the bedroom and she came back with a small gray box and she opened it, and inside was a key, an ordinary looking key. And it was in the back of his sock drawer under a false bottom. And she said, I have never seen him use it, and I have never seen him mention it. And she said, Dad, do you recognize it? I picked up the key and I looked at it and I did recognize it, and my hand started to shake because it was not a house key and it was not a car key. It was the kind of key that opens a safety deposit box, and it had a number on it, and the number was the same number as the branch of the bank where Curtis Bell managed my accounts, the branch where I had my safe deposit box, the branch where Ruth and I had kept our marriage license and our children's birth certificates for 30 years. I sat down before my legs made the decision for me, and I said, Megan, this key is from my bank. And I said, the branch where I keep a box. And she said, Dad, did you ever show him? Did you ever take him there? And I said, no, never. And I have never taken anyone there, not even Andrew. And she said, then how? And I looked at the key and I said, I do not know, but I am going to find out. I called Curtis Bell the next morning, and I did not tell him why. I just asked him to check the access log on my safety deposit box for the past 3 years. Every visit, every name, every time. And Curtis was quiet, and then he said, Frank, I need you to come in. And I drove to the bank in the worst mood of my life. And Curtis met me in his office with the door closed and a folder on his desk. And he said, I checked the logs, Frank, and the box has only been accessed twice in the last 3 years. Once by you with your key and once by a representative of your estate planning attorney with a notarized power of attorney. And I said, a representative, and he said, yes, a man. He presented proper documents. Everything was signed and notarized. A standard record request. He said he needed to take an inventory for a trust review. And I said, Curtis, what was the man's name? And Curtis opened the folder and he read it. And the name on the authorization was Derek Whitfield. And the authorization was signed by my daughter, and my daughter's signature was notarized. I stood up, and I sat down, and I stood up again, and Curtis said, Frank, sit down before you fall down. And I sat, and I said, Curtis, did you watch this man open my box? And Curtis said, I was the one who escorted him. I let him in myself. And I said, and you saw the contents? And he said, I saw him go through the contents and take photographs with his phone. And I said, and you thought that was normal. And Curtis said, Frank, he had a signed authorization from your daughter, your own blood, with a notary stamp, and you had told me years ago that Megan would handle things for you if anything happened, and I believed that authorization was the most natural thing in the world. I said, Curtis, did you not think to call me? And he was quiet, and then he said, I am sorry, Frank. I am so sorry. It was a Tuesday, and you were on my list to call that Friday. And I never called because I told myself it was fine because the paperwork was perfect. And that is the thing about perfect paperwork. It is only perfect if the person holding it is honest. I drove home in a fog and I sat in my garage with the engine off, and I thought about the day Derek walked into my bank with my daughter's name on a piece of paper, and I thought about him standing in front of my box, the box that held my marriage license and my children's birth certificates and my mother's ring, and I thought about his phone out and his camera clicking, and I thought about how he had smiled at Curtis and called him sir, and I felt something move in my chest that I had not felt since I was a young man, and it was not sadness and it was not anger, it was clarity, the kind of clarity that comes at the end of a long confusion, the kind that tells you exactly what you have to do. I went inside and I called Maggie and I told her what Curtis had found, and I told her about the key in the sock drawer, and she said, "Frank, we need to talk about the codicil." And I said, "The codicil is exactly where it needs to be." And she said, "No, Frank, we need to talk about a different kind of document." And she told me what it was, and I said, "Yes." And she said, "Are you sure?" And I said, "I have never been more sure of anything in my life." The next week, I went back to the city, and I did not go to Megan's apartment. I went to a lawyer, not Maggie, a different lawyer, a man named Raymond Sutcliffe, who handles white-collar cases and who Leonard recommended with a single sentence. He said Raymond does not smile until the verdict, and Raymond met me in an office that had no windows and one photograph on the desk, a photograph of a little girl in a soccer uniform. And he listened to the whole story without interrupting. And when I finished, he said, "Mr. Delaney, you have been very careful." And he said, "Do you have the key?" And I said, "I have the key." And he said, keep it somewhere safe." And then he said, "Here is what we are going to do." And he laid out a plan that took 20 minutes to explain and 3 weeks to execute. And I will not bore you with the legal details because the law is long and I am old and you are not here for a lecture. But I will tell you what happened. Derek got a phone call from a developer named Peter Cole, who was real, who existed, who had a reputation, and who had a problem that only a man like Derek could solve, or so Peter said. Peter needed a partner who understood trusts and estates, Peter said, because Peter's mother was aging and her affairs were a mess, and Peter had heard from a mutual friend that Derek Whitfield was the man who knew his way around a fortune. And Derek, who had been circling my dinner table for 2 years, waiting for a bigger table, heard the word fortune and said yes before Peter finished the sentence. They met at a steakhouse in the city, and Raymond Sutcliffe had one of his investigators sitting 2 tables away with a recording device that was legal in this state, and Peter described his mother's estate in detail, 2.1 million in trust, a house in the suburbs, a daughter who was the beneficiary, and he asked Derek, in the most natural way in the world, whether there was any way to get a look at the mother's estate documents before she passed, because Peter did not want to wait, and Derek leaned in and said, "There is always a way, my friend." And he explained how it worked, and his voice was low, and his eyes were bright, and he talked for 40 minutes about notarized authorizations and signatures and bank procedures, and he told Peter that the trick was the daughter. Always the daughter. You get the daughter to sign and the bank does the rest. And he described my own bank, my own branch, my own box, and he described the paperwork he had used, and the investigator recorded every word. Raymond called me 2 days later and said, "Mr. Delaney, I have something you should hear," and he played me the recording, and I sat in my kitchen, and I listened to my son-in-law explain, to a stranger, with enthusiasm, the method he had used to photograph my marriage license and my birth certificates and my mother's ring, and I listened to him say the words, "the old man," and the words, "the daughter," and the words, $800,000 apiece, and I listened to him laugh, that spotlight laugh, and I sat very still until the recording ended, and then I said, "Raymond, I want him arrested." And Raymond said, "Not yet, Mr. Delaney, not yet. Patience is a weapon." And he said, "I am going to write a letter." And I said a letter, and he said a letter, and he sent a letter to Derek Whitfield at his brokerage. And the letter was 1 page, and the page had 4 paragraphs, and the first paragraph said that the writer represented the estate of Frank Delaney, and the second paragraph said that a recorded conversation existed, and the third paragraph said that the recorded conversation had been transcribed and notarized and filed, and the fourth paragraph said that Derek Whitfield had exactly 1 week to resign from his position and leave the state and sign an agreement that he would never contact Megan Delaney again, or the recording and the transcript would be delivered to the district attorney's office, to the state bar, and to the 3 children. And the letter was signed by Raymond Sutcliffe, and the name of the law firm was printed in bold at the top. Megan left him that same week. She packed a bag while Derek was at work, and she drove to my house, and she walked in the door, and she put her keys on the counter, and she said, "Dad, I am sorry." And I said, "For what?" And she said, "For not believing you." And I said, "You believed me. You just needed time. Everybody needs time." And she cried then, the way she had not cried since her mother died. And I held her the way I had held her when she was a little girl with a scraped knee. And I thought about how strange it is that the same arms that hold a child for a scraped knee are the arms that hold a grown woman for a broken heart. And I thought about how I would hold her again if I had to, because that is what fathers are for. Derek did not resign in a week. Derek tried to fight. Derek called my house and left messages that went from charming to confused to threatening in the span of 4 days. And Raymond collected every message and added them to the file. And then Raymond sent a second letter, and the second letter was shorter. And the second letter said that the 1 week deadline had passed and that the matter would be filed with the district attorney's office at 9 o'clock the following morning, and Derek resigned the next day. He left the state with a lease on an apartment that was not his, and a car that was in my daughter's name, and a reputation that would follow him wherever the real estate business does business. And I heard later from Leonard that he had moved to a town in the next state over and had started answering to a different name. And I said, "Leonard, what name?" And Leonard said, "I do not know yet, Frank, but I will tell you when I find out." And I said, "Keep looking, because a man who changes his name is a man who is planning something." The divorce took 8 months, and it was ugly, because Derek wanted the apartment and the car and half of everything Megan had, and Megan's lawyer, a woman named Sandra Whitmore, whom Maggie recommended, took one look at the file Raymond had built and said, "He is going to sign," and he did. He signed away everything on a Thursday afternoon rather than face what was in the file, and the judge granted the divorce on grounds that neither of us mentioned. And Megan came home to my house the night it was final, and she cooked spaghetti, my recipe, and we ate it at the kitchen table, and she said, "Dad, I want to tell you something." And I said, "Go ahead." And she said, "I know you changed the estate plan." And I said, "I know you know." And she said, "Maggie told me." And I said, "I asked her to." And she said, "Thank you." And I said, "So for what?" And she said, "For protecting me from myself." And I said, "Megan, you do not need protecting from yourself. You need protecting from men who look at you and see a door." And she laughed. And it was the first laugh I had heard from her in a year. And she said, "Dad, what did you change?" And I told her, and I will tell you, because you have sat through this whole story and you deserve the ending. The codicil I signed that Friday afternoon, the one I told you about, it did not remove anyone from the estate, because a man does not remove a child from his estate for marrying the wrong person. And it did not punish my daughter for loving a liar, because a father does not punish a child for being deceived. The codicil did one thing: it created a new trust, and the new trust was for Megan's share, and the trustee of that trust was not Megan, and it was not Derek, and it was not even me. The trustee was Maggie Caldwell, and the terms of the trust were simple. The money could not be touched by any spouse, present or future. The money could not be used as collateral. The money could not be attached by any creditor or any lawsuit. And the money paid out to Megan in monthly installments for the rest of her life, with a provision that if she ever found herself in another marriage, that husband could never so much as see the statements. I told Maggie I wanted it that way, and she said, "Frank, you are giving your daughter a leash." And I said, "No, Maggie, I am giving my daughter a fence, and a fence is not a leash. A fence is what keeps the wolves out of the pasture." And she said, "I understand," and she drafted it, and I signed it, and I have never regretted it for one day. Tonight is Thanksgiving, and I am writing this in the kitchen while the turkey rests under foil the way Ruth taught me. And the house smells like her, and the table is set for 7. Andrew and Julia and Tyler, Hannah and her husband, and Megan, who is seeing a therapist now, and who has started dating again, a quiet man named Daniel Reyes, who teaches history at the community college and who held my hand at the door when I opened it and said the stuffing smelled like his grandmother's, which is the right thing to say to me, because I will always measure a man by his manners in my kitchen. Tyler asked me tonight why the turkey takes so long, and I said, "Because good things take time, buddy." And he said, "Like Aunt Megan's new boyfriend," and Julia shushed him, and Megan laughed, and I looked around my table at my family, and I thought about the number 2.4, and I thought about the name Margaret Caldwell, and I thought about the key in the sock drawer and the recording in Raymond's file, and I thought about how close I came to losing my daughter to a man who wanted nothing from me but my death. And I raised my glass, and they all raised theirs, and I said, "To the family," and it is the same toast I made last year, but it means more this year, because this year I know what it costs to keep them all sitting at this table. And if Derek Whitfield is listening to this story somewhere, in whatever town he is calling himself by a new name in, I want him to know that the key did not fit the lock he thought it fit, And the box he photographed was not the box he thought it was, and the daughter he married was never the door he thought she was, and the old man he was waiting to die is still here, still cooking spaghetti, still standing at the table with his glass raised, and I am not going anywhere anytime soon, and if that upsets your plans, I am sorry, but not very. And to everyone else, to everyone who has ever loved someone who lied to them, I will tell you what Leonard Marsh told me the week he handed me the file. You do not have to be right the first time. You only have to be right the last time, and I was, and my daughter is safe, and that is worth every sleepless night and every mile I drove in the rain, and I would do it all again tomorrow, because that is what fathers do. We carry the truth until our children are ready to take it from our hands, and then we stay at the table, and we raise our glass, and we wait for the turkey to rest, and we give thanks for the family we kept, and the wolves we turned away from the door.